Cek. Cek, cek, cek. Cek, 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 cek. Hah? Oh iya. Mau pakai laptop itu atau mau pakai itu? Anu, ada. Berarti taruh di depan aja. Pointernya ada. Oh iya, nanti biar diambil. Hmm. Gak usah lewat lewat nganu aja. Gak usah diproposi langsung lewat belakangnya. Yang penting kan nggak nyandung. Tapi dicek ada Microsoft Office-nya enggak? Ya, kali. Hah? PDF, oh ya. Nah, udah. PDF, oh ya. Cek, berapa Bu? Hmm? Di gede ki. Masuk, cek, cek. Berarti ini saya audio. Eh? Kurang gede tak? Nah, kurang gede tak besarkan, cek dulu. Cek, cek. Kurang. Cek, 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 cek. Nganu, apa? Enggak stereo masalahnya. Ini enggak stereo. Cek, cek, cek. Cek, cek. Sudah ya? Mas Rahmat. Cek. Banter. Cek, cek. Eh? Ojo rasuriu, enggak, memang enggak stereo. Aman. Audionya enggak stereo. Wong saka konone mono. Ya ora apa-apa sing penting wis dikene. Wis mestine digawe mono aja. Digawe mono. Ini kene. Cek, cek, cek. Oh iya.
Cek cek.
Kira wis enake belum.
Cek cek cek.
So shall I begin? It's good? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for inviting me to this event. It's been wonderful for my first time in Indonesia. I'm very happy to meet all of you in person if I haven't met you before. And today I want to talk about, as the title says, the importance of philosophy for understanding preferences for the local, linguistic, mathematical, and social perspectives. And I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about where I am from, because I work at a place called the Archives Poincaré, which is a research center in history and philosophy of science in Nancy and also in Strasbourg, France, in the east of France. And we're a research center, so we have about 40 researchers full-time who work in these subjects, but we don't only study history and philosophy of science, we also study philosophy, we study a number of other things. We're called the Archives Poincaré because we have a large collection of the work of the mathematician and physicist Henri Poincaré. We have his personal letters for his entire life, and we also have put these on the internet, so we spend a lot of time and energy digitalizing archives. So we work in digital humanities now as well. And we are located in Nancy, France. So this is a beautiful town in the east of France. The place I have shown you on this picture is the Place Stanislas, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so if you can come to see us, we will be very happy to host you in Nancy. We would be very welcoming of master's students and PhD students also to study in our laboratory and in the Department of Philosophy in Nancy. Okay, with that introduction then, I thought I would come to the subject of the talk, which is to talk to you about the notion of the local. And the local is maybe not something that you have, that you think of, perhaps not because of philosophy at first. What is local is what we think of as being close to us, or what is well known to us. And many people will say that it is good, for instance, to do things that are local for us. For instance, to eat food that comes from close to where we are, local eating. And we see this in English language places. In French, we also see requests to eat locally. And also I see that in Indonesia, there is also, in Yogyakarta as well, the idea that there are things that are special to this place that are local, and they are good to keep for us because they are local. So these are examples of what I mean by preferences for the local. The idea that we could try to stay with things that are close to us, and that it's good to do that. The examples that I tried to talk about so far come from shopping. And what I want to talk about today then are different kinds of what I want to call localisms, by which I mean preferences for the local. And I also want to talk about the reasons that we give for preferring things that are local to us. And I want to talk about three kinds of localisms today. What I mean by that. And then I want to talk about mathematical localisms, which will probably seem to you very different at first. And one of my points today is to show us that by philosophy, we can see that all three of these kinds of localisms have something in common, and something surprising, I think. So that's my goal for today. Let me start then with what I've been calling consumer localisms. The first examples came from shopping, as I told you, for food, to prefer food that is local to us. So not only do we see these kinds of preferences, we see reasons for these preferences. So you will be better at reading this text for me, but it's an example of a text in the Indonesian language, not in Javanese language, but in Indonesian, that gives reasons for preferring what is local. And the place that I found this explanation of preferring what is local to Indonesia is from a website, from a kind of blog, and I'll make this larger for you so that you can read it more closely, because it shows you examples of the reasons that people offer for preferring what is local. So here I wrote the text in Indonesian and also in English so that I can read it more easily. So the first reason that they give in the text that I just showed you was that by buying local products, we directly provide support to local entrepreneurs so that they can continue to grow and create jobs for the surrounding community. So this is a kind of economic argument that we should buy things that are local to us so that we can help the people economically that are close to us, local businesses and local producers. They then give a second kind of reason for preferring what's local when it comes to buying. They tell us that buying local products also means that we are participating in strengthening the domestic economic chain. When we choose local products, the money that we spend will continue to circulate domestically, and this will have a positive impact on national economic growth. So this is a second reason to prefer what's local. But again, it's an economic reason that we will give money to people who are local, and this money then will stay close to us in the place that we are. There's a third kind of reason that they offer, which I'll then read to you. They say that in addition to providing an economic impact, buying local products also has other benefits that are no less important. Local products are generally produced with raw materials from within the country, so their use is more economically friendly and sustainable. This means that we are participating in preserving the natural resources of Indonesia. So this is also a kind of economic argument, but not economic about money, but about the natural resources of Indonesia. And so the preference for local products also reflects a desire to sustain what is local. And then they give one last reason, which is that in addition, by buying local products, we also help maintain the sustainability of Indonesian traditions and culture contained in these products. So this is a different kind of argument, that the culture of Indonesia should be preserved, and that by buying local products, we can preserve that culture. So these are some examples of the reasons that people will offer for their desire to buy local, for their preference for the local, for their localism. So I characterize these as consumer localisms as economic, political, and cultural values. They are economic in that they try to sustain the local economy. They're political because they help sustain the national unity of the place. And they're cultural because they contribute to the preservation of local traditions. That was the first example of a localism that I wanted to talk about. Next, I want to talk about linguistic localisms. The first kind of example I want to talk about of linguistic localisms are the example of words that are borrowed from other languages in a local language. So one of the things that I've noticed since I arrived here in Indonesia is the word gratis. I have seen this many, many places. When I went to Borobudur, I was in the car for some time, and many times at gas stations or at stores, I could see the sign for gratis, and I wondered what this meant. And I looked and I saw that it's a word, because of course I know this word in French, but it's also a word in the Dutch language, which means like a free thing, like a given to you without having to pay for it. And I see that this is a word that comes to the Indonesian language from the Dutch language. And there are many examples because the Indonesian language, as opposed to Javanese language, it was a construction that borrowed words from many different languages in order to find a language for national unity. So this is interesting. We also see something like this in Japanese language. There are words that, for instance, the word here, it's talking about a smartphone, And the first three letters there say smaho in Japanese. And when I talk to Japanese people, they tell me that they don't even know that this word comes from the English language. It's a Japanese way of writing smartphone, but they believe that it is a word that comes from Japanese originally, not borrowed from English language. So we find that sometimes even borrowed words, we don't even remember that they come, or even know that they come from another language. In France, we have strong policies about this thing. So here's an example of an advertisement you might see on the metro in Paris for a car that is made in France, and it says, unboring the future. This is not a very good use of English language, but it means to make the future more interesting. But one thing you might see at the bottom of this, I don't think there is there laser? No? No? Is that there's a little mark that has a translation of the expression unboring the future in French. And that's because since 1994, there is an official law in France that requires that all advertisements be written, or if they are spoken, or if they are on the screen on a TV, they must always be given in French translation. It is illegal to only use the foreign language in France. You must use the the French language. And this is not only true for English language, it's also true for if a word happens in Spanish language. Les gazpachos qui son muy buenos, they have a translation of this. You can't see it very well because the screen is a little small, but you can see that there is again a mark at the bottom that writes the word in French. So no matter which language, it must be written in French. And a few years after that law, the law called Tout Bon in France means that all official communications in France must be done in the French language. There must, in fact, be always an equivalent word for any word in the French language. So you are not in university functions or in government functions. If there is a word that comes from another language, you must find a French equivalent to this. And the determination of the French equivalent is licensed by an institution called the Académie Française. So this is a beautiful building in Paris that has existed since the 17th century, since Louis XIV, the King of France, the Sun King, instituted this building and the people who make judgments about the words of the French language. And from the beginning, they created the first dictionary, official dictionary of the French language, which gives many, many words that are now the legal requirement to use in France. And still today, you can look on their website. This exists now mostly on the internet. And they have a blog that every day will, or not every day, but several times a week, will publish, it's called Dire ne pas dire, that says say or don't say. It's rules about what is good and what is bad to say in the French language. And one of the things they are especially interested in is the notion of Anglicisms and foreign words in the French language. So I will give you a larger version of what they say here. So they have a text in French, which in English translation says that weddings are often presented as the happiest day in the lives of those who are getting married. It is therefore important that everything is perfect, and to do this, the future spouses sometimes use a wedding planner. This trend from the United States has brought with it the arrival of a new Anglicism, wedding planner. The word in French would be organisateur de mariage, marriage organizer. And the writers from the Académie Française say, would the wedding be less successful if we used the equivalent French form, which we already encounter in common usage? This is an argument for why we should prefer the use of the French word. Not only is it legally required to use the French word, but we should prefer to use the French word. And the argument here is that there would be no problem for the success of the marriage if we used the word in French rather than borrowing the word in English. The English language does not give more power to the wedding itself, to the success of the wedding. So that's an example of a kind of argument you see. But a different kind of argument you see for the use of the French, use of avoiding foreign words in a language comes from an essay by George Orwell. You might know Orwell from the book 1984, which was a book about totalitarian governments in Europe. But in 1946, just after Second World War, Orwell published an article called Politics and the English Language in a popular journal of literature and art called Horizon. And in this essay, Orwell gave arguments from the point of view of fighting totalitarianism for avoiding foreign words. So Orwell tells us that modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits which are spread by imitation and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. If one gets rid of these habits, one can think more clearly. And to think clearly is a necessary first step towards political regeneration. So for Orwell, good language is connected to good politics. If we speak the language or we write the language in a bad way, we are more easily taken by totalitarian government. This is the argument that Orwell gives in the paper. And one specific example of bad English, he says, is the use of foreign words and expressions in the English language. So words from French like cul-de-sac or ancien régime, word from Latin, deus ex machina, mutandis mutandis, status quo, words from German like Gleichschaltung and Weltanschauung are used, Orwell says, to give an air of culture and elegance. Except for the useful abbreviations, like etc., there is no real need for any of the hundreds of foreign phrases now current in English. So Orwell thinks that there is also a political reason to avoid the use of foreign words in our language. So we see here, we have seen arguments for that it is more useful and helpful to use the natural language, the local language. But here we also see a political argument for using the local language instead of borrowed language. But one other kind of issue that arises with respect to linguistic localisms are questions of regional languages. In Indonesia, of course, there are many, many, many regional languages. So here I found an image that only has a very few number of regional languages. And as I've been here, I've been talking to some of you about language in Indonesia because I'm very interested in the ways in which people communicate locally. It's part of the concept of Nusantara to understand how a country as diverse with respect to culture and with respect to language can exist as a unity. And the idea I've heard is that people will speak to each other depending on the setting, depending on the context, in one language or another language. Perhaps you will speak in Javanese if you are speaking to someone in your family. But if you are in school, perhaps you are speaking more in Indonesian. It's a way to communicate in different ways with different groups. And this has communicative value, but it also has political value in terms of ensuring the unity of the country. Now, in France, we have a similar issue. Perhaps it is not so well known, but that in France, the French language, as I said, the reason that we have a law that requires the French language is in part because of the existence of foreign languages, but also because within France, we have many regional languages. So this is a map that just shows you some of the regional languages, and the big words like Basque, Breton, Flamand, Francois, Mosellan, Alsacien. So we are in the very east in Lorraine, and there is a local regional language in Lorraine. And some of the most famous ones in Breton, there is currently a movement of independence from France, in part based on their language. They want to be able to speak their language. And now there is an exception in French law that you can take your high school exit exams in the local language of Breton, not in French if you choose to. So this is an explosive issue in French politics. a question of whether we should favor the French language or whether we should allow other languages. During the French Revolution, these regional languages were made illegal for the first time because the idea was that the unity of the nation depended on there being one language, but unlike Nusantara, which accepts the coexistence of regional languages and a unified language, in French, the thought was that a unified country could only exist with one language. During the Second World War, however, Germany invaded France and installed a new government called Vichy government. And Vichy government, for the first time since the French Revolution, allowed the use of regional languages. Because Vichy, which was movement allied with the Nazi Germany, believed that each people had a right to their own language, and so they should be free to speak their language alone. And this is something that I'm currently working a lot on, so I hopefully will have more to say about the changes in the French language under Vichy. But in brief, there was a movement towards localism, towards allowing legally regional languages. Now, there is much more to say about that, but in summary, we can see that linguistic localisms have aesthetic, but also political and cultural values behind them. Now, I also told you I wanted to talk about mathematical localisms, and that's the third localism that I'll talk to you about. And this one will probably seem to you more strange because mathematics seems to us to be the most universal discourse that we have. There are people who believe, many people believe that even if we met people from another planet, they would still understand the same mathematics as we do. In fact, when the United States sent a satellite into orbit, they put mathematics on a disk on the satellite so that when they met an alien civilization, those aliens would be able to understand who we are because they would recognize our mathematics. So mathematics seems to be something that is universal. And therefore, it is going to sound strange to you that I will talk about mathematical localisms. But what I will talk about is not mathematical localisms in the same cultural sense that we were talking about for shopping and for language, but in a different sense, because mathematics, like the world, seems to be organized in a way like different countries. And if you look, you will find a lot of maps of the world of mathematics written like this. This is a kind of funny one that has different parts of mathematics, like in the very center you see geometry and arithmetic, but you will also see tundra of topology, ocean of logic, the caliphate of algebra, because algebra comes to us from the Arab word and the Arab world. And the idea is that there are these different parts of mathematics. And in school, you learn these different parts. Maybe you even spend some time studying geometry, some time studying arithmetic, some time studying algebra. And the question then becomes, what is the relationship between these different parts of mathematics? One of the parts that people will talk about a lot when they speak of the map of mathematics is what we call synthetic geometry. This is the part of geometry where there are no equations, where you just write figures. This is the way that it was done in Greek times, in ancient Greek times. It was then done this way in the ancient and medieval Arab world. And then this was communicated into the Latin language in the Renaissance. But what also came along with that transmission of mathematics was the writings of Aristotle, whose philosophy taught us in his text on logic posterior analytics that we cannot, in demonstrating, pass from one kind to another. We cannot, for instance, prove geometrical truths by arithmetic. So here we see a different kind of localism in mathematics. There is still, it should be that we prefer, when we are working in geometry, says Aristotle, to prefer the demonstrations, the proofs that are geometrical, to not move to a different part of the map, to choose geometry for solving problems in geometry, instead of trying to borrow arithmetic to do geometry. The idea is that arithmetic is foreign in the world of geometry. And similarly, that geometry is foreign in the world of arithmetic. And for Aristotle, this becomes his whole metaphysics. It's based on a classification of the world into different kinds. And to know the world in science, in ethics, in politics, in art, we must always know what the kinds are. And we must always respect this rule, to never cross kinds, to always stay local. And in mathematics, this had a powerful impact. Mathematicians stayed very close to this rule until René Descartes in 17th century, who created for the first time a way of mixing geometry and arithmetic with the art that they called algebra, developed in the Arab world in the Middle Ages. So here you see a text from La Géométrie, the text of Descartes, which shows you a picture, so geometry, but also equations, which are supposed to tell us something about the geometry. Algebra and geometry work together. And this is an amazing response to Aristotle, who had said, you should not mix these. Descartes said, I will mix them. Because for Descartes, he thought that this would make doing geometry easier. He thought that geometry in the old way was too difficult. Synthetic geometry was too difficult. Algebra would make it easier. So in this way, we see, this is just a zoom-in version of the map from before, that there is this area that is called the swamps of algebraic geometry. This is the part where geometry and algebra mix together. Very close to the center, but not the center. Still today in mathematics, algebraic geometry is very important, but it's a mixing of two areas. And not all mathematicians have been very happy with this. Many mathematicians decided to try to do algebra and geometry together at the same time. So here is a book from the just after Descartes, a book that was used by Rousseau and by D'Alembert in the writing. They were the two important 18th century philosophers, and they learned their mathematics from this book here, written by someone named Lamy. And it's going to be difficult for you to see because this is too small, but Lamy gives for every problem one solution in synthetic geometry, in just regular geometry, and then also he gives the equations, he gives the algebra. So he does it both ways, a kind of diversity of approaches. But as I said a moment ago, not everyone is happy with this diversity. So Isaac Newton is an example of someone who will say something against unity in mathematics, or yes, for a kind of localism. Newton, we have many of his books, and we know that he knew how to do algebra. This is just one notebook of the writing in the hand of Isaac Newton. But Newton gave lectures where he told us that equations are expressions belonging to arithmetical computation, and in geometry properly have no place unless you are talking about lines or properly geometric objects. He says algebraic equations are bad in geometry. We should keep these areas separately. He says this mixing of geometry and algebra is recently introduced. He means by Descartes. But he says this is ill-considered and contrary to the original intentions of this science. Because he says if you study ancient geometry, you will see that they created their geometry, like Euclid, like Apollonius, ancient geometers, created geometry, he says, to escape the tediousness of calculation by drawing. So the thought was that Descartes had made a mistake in introducing algebra in geometry, in mixing these two areas. Descartes had broken the beauty and the power of ancient geometry. Newton says we should keep these areas separate. We should prefer, when we are doing geometry, what is local to geometry. When we are doing arithmetic, we can prefer what is local to arithmetic. This is also no problem. says Descartes, says Newton. This text is a textbook on algebra, but nonetheless, there is a reason to prefer what is local in mathematics. And he says finally that we should do this because we should do what the ancients did. The ancients never mixed geometry and algebra. And secondly, when we mix them, we lose the elegance of geometry. So this is a kind of aesthetic argument, as well as a respect for tradition of that we, the modern people, should do what the ancients did. So that's why we have this area now called algebraic geometry, created by Descartes, that is so controversial because it seems to leave the local areas of geometry and arithmetic and move to a different area. But one of the questions that is interesting is it really a different area? Because Descartes seemed to think that seeing them as different areas was just a mistake. He says in this letter that he writes to his friend Mersenne that those who know the conjunction that is between geometry and arithmetic cannot doubt that all one can do by arithmetic can also be done by geometry. But to want to make this understood to those who conceive of them as completely distinct sciences, this would be a waste of time. Finally, Descartes thought, in fact, geometry and algebra, or geometry and arithmetic, were not two different countries on the map. They were the same place. But he could not make it so that someone who didn't already see that could understand it. So Descartes thought that the map of mathematics was different, that it had changed, that geometry and algebra were no longer different countries, but had become the same country. And therefore, the localism that he preferred was a kind of mixed localism. There was a unity in mathematics. So we have here then a fight between two different views of localism. We have Descartes, who thought that, yes, it's good to be local, but there is a new country to be local to, a unity, a kind of nusantara of mathematics between geometry and arithmetic. And Newton, who thinks, no, there are always two different countries. So in this way, Newton was a traditionalist, a classicist, and Descartes was a revolutionary, a modern. And this kind of relationship between change and conservative and tradition leads us to a concern with what nowadays we like to call the purity of mathematics. Just one mathematician who spoke a lot about purity was in the 20th century, a French mathematician named Jean Dieudonné, who was a member of the group of mathematicians called Bourbaki, which I could talk to you about a different time. Bourbaki was a very interesting group of mathematicians. It's going to be, this is too small, but what Bourbaki, what Dieudonné tells us is that he says, I am interested in modern mathematics. So this is not just from a long time ago. This is from less than 100 years ago. He says, modern mathematics tries to unify different countries, but it also tries to separate countries. And he says that some will find this insistence on purity superfluous and pedantic. But for my part, he says, I feel that one must always try to understand what one is doing as well as one can, and that it is good discipline for the mind to adapt hypotheses as closely to conclusions as is possible. Closely, that is local. There's a preference here for the local in mathematics, and the reason he says we should prefer what is local is that we can understand what we are doing better. So what we find here with Dieudonné is a different kind of reason. With consumer reasoning, we found economic reasons for preferring local. For language, we found aesthetic and political reasons for preferring what is local. And here in mathematics, we find reasons that concern our knowledge for what is local, what we philosophers would call epistemic reasons. And for this reason, then, I have a new book that you can find. So in fact, it will only be published next week, finally, with Cambridge University Press on this subject called Elements of Purity. So fresh off the presses, my new book on these kinds of things. And today, what I want to emphasize with this talk of purity is that we've seen, as I said here, three kinds of localisms. Consumer localisms as economic values, linguistic localisms as aesthetic values, and mathematical localisms as epistemic values. But we also saw that consumer localisms could be understood not only as economic, but also as political values. They bring together the country by preferring, or they bring together a local place by preferring the products of that local place. Linguistic localisms have aesthetic value, but also political value, because if we speak our local language, we can contribute to clarity, we can fight against totalitarianism, or we can keep our language clear and effective, like the Académie Française. Lots of different reasons, but they are at one time both aesthetic and political. But until now, it seems that the mathematical talk is only epistemic. We only talk about why our knowledge is better. And the last thing I want to talk about today is a way to see mathematical localisms also as political localisms. So this will be difficult to see, but this is a new book from last year, 2023, with University of Chicago Press by a historian of mathematics who works at University of California, Berkeley. And the book, his name is Massimo Mazzotti, and the book is called Reactionary Mathematics, A Genealogy of Purity. And the title, Reactionary Mathematics, suggests a political understanding of mathematics. And the story that Mazzotti tells us in his book is a story of an episode in Italy in 19th century. What happened in Italy was that it was many different kingdoms. There was no country of Italy yet, no nation. But there was a war. Napoleon came, invaded Italy, and conquered the kingdom of Naples, Napoli, and installed a French government. So there was a colonialization of parts of Italy by France. And during this occupation of Italy by France, of Naples by France, the French tried to put on, with their local supporters, a project of modernization to transform the nation of Napoli, of Italy, into a modern nation, a French nation. Because until then, Italy was a feudal economy, many different local interests who tried to preserve their local power. And part of the modernization brought by France was mathematical modernization. As Mazzotti explains, they had many problems in trying to colonialize Italy. They had problems with the local conditions. There were the roads were not good. There were many bandits. There were lots of people who fought against the new invaders. And many elites wanted to preserve their power. But they also, as Mazzotti says, one need only open a Neapolitan textbook of the time to realize that the French were battling in a land where their mathematics was wrong. So the local mathematics was another way of resistance to the colonialization by the French invaders. So by the French, in particular, what Mazzotti is talking about is the mathematical work of Lagrange, Joseph-Louis Lagrange, who wrote a textbook called the Théorie des fonctions analytiques, so the theory of analytic functions. This is the first modern textbook in what we nowadays would call calculus or analysis. And in Italy, this mathematics was viewed as an invasion, as a violation of local tradition. Even though today, you will only learn in school this modern mathematics. The war finally is won by modern mathematics. But in Italy, they viewed this movement as an invasion. As Mazzotti says, to them, reform was French and alien, guided by abstract egalitarian norms that conflicted with both local traditions and common sense. Provincial borders had been redrawn in ways that ignored local history and customs, so that the new mathematics violated what was local. And what Mazzotti shows is that we see this view in favor of what is local, not only in resistance to the government of France by Italians, by Neapolitans, but also in their mathematics. So one mathematician in particular, Nicola Fergola, and his school did mathematics that was very much like what Newton was trying to do. So that here he tells us of one student, Bruno, of this guy, Fergola, who is trying to solve problems in geometry using only geometrical means, no algebra, no analysis. The way that we can characterize it, as Mazzotti does, no reference was made to geometrical truths external to the problem, thus preserving its true unpolluted nature, a local nature. So once again, in the mathematics of Neapolitan resistance to France, we find a preference for the local, this time in mathematics. And Mazzotti says that this is then, we see mathematical localisms in the same context as political and moral resistances to revolutions from outside. He says that in Italy, reactionaries perceived algebraicized mathematics as degenerated knowledge responsible for the moral and political breakdown of Europe. By contrast, they promoted synthesis as the restoration, the return to an alleged ancient wisdom that would restore and support traditional hierarchies, both social and natural. So that resistance to French mathematics was part of a movement to restore social order in Italy. For Mazzotti, the observation is that to see mathematics in this way does not mean that to see mathematics as reflecting political decisions does not mean that doing mathematics is always and only political. There are also purely mathematical reasons to do what we do in mathematics. But what Mazzotti wants us to see is that there are two stories in mathematics. There's always, when we talk about localisms, this is at one time political and at one time mathematical, or what I would call epistemic. And these two stories happen together. You cannot separate the epistemic from the political. This is a philosophical observation about localisms. They always speak in different ways. They say, oh, we are interested in, for instance, economic values. We prefer to shop locally because it helps our economy. We prefer our language locally, our own regional language, or the avoiding foreign words because it has aesthetic value. Or we prefer our local mathematics because it is epistemically valuable. But we've seen that these three kinds of localisms are also political values, all at the same time. So that what we see finally is that all three localisms involve political and cultural values. Even though on the surface these three localisms seem very different, shopping, language, mathematics. But when we understand them from the point of view of a philosophical analysis, we can see that underneath the surface, these all reflect political and cultural values. So just one last word then about political localisms. I think that here in Indonesia, we see one good approach to solving these problems of localisms. And we see it with the concept of Pancasila, in which we learn that there can be diversity, but we can also learn at the same time that there is unity, so that many different local preferences can still exist together at the same time as a kind of Nusantara, as a kind of approach or outlook that takes the whole. So to find a balance between the local and the more global is a challenge that in Indonesia you are working on a very interesting solution. And my proposal then, and this is the end of my talk, is that to take that approach to look at not only questions of consumerism and of language, but also in mathematics, is a wonderful approach to try to understand these debates in mathematics that seem very distant, perhaps, from what we normally think about in terms of the local, but to also try to approach this mathematics from the point of view of a kind of Nusantara. This to me is a very interesting project. So I believe, yes, that's all I have to say. So thank you very much.
In post-colonial society. Here, we are a post-colonial country, and the society, even though you show that there is an advertisement preference for local product, but the society, the people are prouder of using non-local product. Or we are people who use English fluently look smarter than who doesn't. And how localism you describe, explain that phenomena. And my second question is localism that you mentioned is just a type of simplicity principle prescribed by Occam Razor? We prefer local explanation because it's simpler. That's questions. Thank you.
Good. So yes, thank you. Those are excellent questions, and I'll start with the first question. That, as you said, that that to prefer what is foreign, for instance, can be seen as a mark of importance. In the case of language, perhaps here in Indonesia, if I speak English, it makes me appear smarter. Or if I use, for instance, maybe the rice that I use comes from a different place. This could maybe seem more impressive. If my car or my food I eat international food, perhaps this shows that I have a different kind of culture, higher culture, perhaps even. This was interesting. When I went to Borobudur, I saw rice being grown for the first time in my life. So I had never seen rice being grown. So I just haven't been to Southeast Asia before. And I thought it was very amazing and beautiful. But I remember on the drive into Yoga, I was asking, do people here eat the rice that is grown in Indonesia? And I guess I heard from the person I was with that here in Indonesia, much of the rice that is eaten comes from Thailand. And I don't know if that's true, but if that's correct, that's interesting to me, because there's a kind of, again, even though there's a preference, there could be a preference for what is local, there's also some kind of value in having the rice that comes from another place. Maybe this is an economic argument. Perhaps it is less expensive to bring in the rice from another place. Also, perhaps the rice that is grown in Indonesia can be used for other local products, like food for animals, for instance. But these are cases where we see, these are economic cases. In the case of language, you also saw that as you say, in a post-colonial society, there were foreign languages here. There was, of course, the Dutch language. Then the creation of Indonesian language, which still has many, many words from Dutch language. And then now, in a global context, we have English as a language. I mean, here I am speaking English with you in Indonesia. I'm sorry for that, but in a way, it shows exactly your point, that there is a sense in which the foreign language has a certain kind of value. Not only the value in that it allows us to speak together, but also that value could become something that is destructive psychologically, and that it might make us think that we are inferior if we do not speak the global language. And that puts pressure on the local traditions. In France, the solution has been violent. The solution was to make it illegal to use foreign language. So when I teach a class, if I use the English language or Spanish, I have to be very careful. And this is currently a subject of a great deal of debate. For instance, in Nancy, we have some classes in our masters now that are in English, and we want to very soon have our whole master's program in philosophy in English. but this is technically illegal in France. Now, the dynamics are very different because post-colonial societies have a different status. France was a colonial power, and France views its language as a dominant language. And to preserve its dominance on a global scale, they have put this law in on a local scale. The situation in post-colonial societies in Indonesia, in India, the situation is very different. And the push for a local language would have a different kind of context. So finally, that was many, many things that I said to your first question. I think that the approach of Nusantara to me is an interesting approach because it provides a way forward that is not the French approach, which says only one language, no foreign languages, not even any regional languages should be supported. But it also provides a way to allow people to work together and have a single unity. So I think that it is very important, and everyone I think knows this, to preserve local languages, but to be multilingual then. To me, this is a way, but it cannot answer the psychological burden that concerns rather the construction of class and the way that class is perceived on a local scale and on a global scale. And I did today want to talk about Bourdieu and things like this, but I don't have time. So your first question is very perceptive, and I think we should talk about it a lot more. In the case of your second question, which now I'm going to have forgotten some. Can you remind me? Sorry.
Simplicity principle.
Yes.
Or Occamreser.
Yes. Yes, right. So we will prefer, for instance, when speaking a language, we might prefer to speak our local language just because it's simpler. Or to buy a product that is local, well, it's simpler. It's less expensive, for instance, to buy a product that is made here instead of being brought from further away in Indonesia or from overseas someplace. It's just simpler to buy what is close to me, or to speak what's close to me, or in science and mathematics, to use the things that I already know instead of trying to learn something new, even if I think that learning something new might make it more simple in the future. There's a kind of economic logic that says we should always do what is easiest or simpler. And it seems to me that in all three of these domains, in consumer domains, linguistic domains, and mathematical domains, we see a tension between kinds of simplicity. The simplicity of using what we already know versus the simplicity that would happen after we learn something new and speak in a new way, or shop in a new way, or do mathematics in a new way. And I think that one of the things that philosophy helps us do is to understand the balance that we need to find between this one kind of simplicity and other kinds of simplicity. So in short, I think your answer is, your question is perceptive because there are different kinds of simplicity that are at stake here. And knowing how to negotiate those is not easy. It's not a very satisfying answer, but you have very much identified a problem. I think there is a microphone.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for your kind explanation. I just want to ask you, what do you think about the language adoption and translation into the practical contextuality, especially the language using has historical portrait based on regional or local area backgrounds? Do you wonder that the language using improve through the political, cultural, and social interests? And what do you think about interest in language using, also the claims of language using? Thank you, sir.
Great question about translation, because one of the things that we learned in the mathematical case from Descartes originally was he shows us a way to translate problems in geometry into the language of algebra. So this is thinking of translation in the mathematical case, and he frames it in terms of translation. Next week, I will go to Vienna, Austria, to give a presentation on translation in mathematics using some logical work. I won't talk about that now, but it's to say that the issue of translation in mathematics is very important. And one of the things that we see in philosophical contexts is that the question of translation is a difficult one, because there are some philosophers in France especially now who think that there are words that are and ideas that are not translatable from one language to another. So there was recently published, well, 20 years ago now, a dictionary of untranslatables by someone who works in France. Barbara Cassin is a philosopher in France. And she argues, along with many other colleagues, that that what we express in one language, especially in philosophical language, cannot always be fully translated into another language. So this dictionary of untranslatables is a philosophical text. It's very, very large, of concepts like God, like soul, or knowledge, looking at them from the point of view of different linguistic philosophical understandings. So she and her colleagues explain how in a French context these words will mean one thing, and we can try to translate them into other contexts, but we are always missing something. And in my new book, I have a discussion of translation, short, but there will be more coming soon, about the ways that in mathematics we also see questions of what cannot be translated. So that understanding what is lost when we translate is an important part of working in a multilingual situation. So I imagine that in Indonesia, and I want to hear much more about this, about the linguistic situation here, but also cultural situation, what is lost when we try to speak Indonesian instead of speaking our more local language? What is it that we find easier or better to say in Javanese instead of in Indonesian or other languages? These are questions that need to be answered to approach the larger philosophical question of, is there something close about our understanding of the world and our use of our language? There is research in education that suggests that we learn better in our own language than we learn in our first language than we learn in our other languages. But we live in a world now, so my children speak several different languages. I was born in the United States, but then I moved to France. My children are also now, we are both French and American. They go to school in France. They've learned everything for 10 years in France, but in the French language exclusively. But then before, they learned things in English. So they live in a world that is both English and in French. You live in a world that is both Indonesian and in the local language here would be Javanese. There are multiple local languages, but we are also speaking in English. What do we lose? What do we understand better and worse when we are speaking one language versus another? These are things that I think philosophy is only beginning to try to understand. And I think that we need to think about the details, not talking with people in sociology, for instance, not only from the point of view of a kind of abstract understanding, but also in a precise way. And I think that this issue goes pretty deeply. Just one last word on this. I was speaking with someone the other day here. I looked in your library to see if there was a textbook in intermediate logic in Indonesian, and I didn't find one. And I have been working with some people who are teaching logic in Israel to Palestinian students, and they have no textbook in the Arab language, in Arabic, in intermediate logic also. As you know, Arabic is one of the world's most important languages, but still, if a student wants to learn logic, she will have to get a book in either French or English or German. In Indonesian, it seems that maybe something like this is true also. And so what there needs to be is a push for translations of works into local languages. In the context, I know I'm talking a lot, but sorry, but there is precedent for a program like this. I've been studying, I visit Japan a lot because I work with many different Japanese philosophers on many different subjects. And one thing that I am always interested in is that Japan transformed from a country that was purely rural to a country that is heavily industrialized very quickly, and it did so without being colonized. So it had a kind of internal transformation. And there has been a recent study by economists showing that their transformation happened because of a massive government program of translation of technical manuals in English, German, French, and Dutch into Japanese language. So that by the end of the 19th century, there were more technical books in Japanese than there were in German. 30 years before that, it happened so fast, 20, 30 years. There was a transformation from Japanese having no textbooks in industrial methods, in mathematics, in science, to having more texts than in any other language in the world. And with that translation came the rise of Japan as an industrial and finally as a colonial power. So I know that's a difficult history here in Indonesia. But it is an example of how translation contributed in one very concrete case to an economic transformation. And I would propose as a kind of political project that it would be good for logicians like myself to work on local communities in translating our texts into local languages. As I said, I have a project to work on an Arabic translation or to write a text in Arabic, but I don't speak Arabic. I need local partners. The same would be true in Indonesia. I would need local partners to help coordinate a project of creating a text in logic, intermediate logic, that students in Indonesia then could use themselves in their own language. So if that's a project that you would be interested in, I'm looking for partners in your language. But so there, I will stop talking then.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. What can I say from localism is like using local resources instead of outside resources. Correct me if I'm wrong. And my question is like, how can emphasize on localism contribute to addressing global challenges? Since maybe in local consumerism, domestic economic cycle which are good for creating harmony or sustainability, but perhaps not good for globalism, or maybe this is the strategy of against globalization, and thus a focus on local knowledge risks creating an exclusivity. I'm just afraid like when people search using only local knowledge being valid and wiser rather than other knowledge. Yeah, this is my question. Thank you very much.
An excellent question and a difficult one because we know the history of localisms, that sometimes then these can become movements, and we're speaking politically, of resistance and even of violence. So in the case of France, when I spoke about the Vichy government, this was of course the Nazi Germans who instituted that government in France. And the Nazi government was a violent and anti-globalization force in a way, but they wanted to preserve local identities, that is of the German identity, and they thought that other identities should even be exterminated, they should be killed. So they were against Jewish people, but also against Polish people. The idea was in Russian people that all these other people were bad and should be eliminated. And so preferences for the local can maybe even easily become preferences for violence and for exclusion rather than inclusion. We saw that in Germany. We see that in various cases in France, where the people who tend to preserve preferences for the French language come from the right wing, who support not only a strong local government, but also opposition to foreigners. Right now in Europe, we have strong movements of anti-immigration, and in part, these are movements that want to preserve the local identity of France against other cultures. And again, in the context of Indonesia, I would like to listen to you much more to understand how this happens here. But I think that the that the history of separatist movements in Indonesia is also related to these questions of how can we have both at the same time interests in what is local, but also interest in what is bringing us together. And the concept of Nusantara is an attempt to do this, and I think it deserves all of our interest in our respect and our work to make it happen. But because I think that with it, we have the possibility of finding a kind of unity that transcends these local differences. But the importance in the end is the unity, not only the diversity. So, so there are some very ugly histories involved with localism, but I think at the same time, there is so much good in localism and so much that maybe isn't even communicable except in our own local ways, in our own local language, that we must try to find a balance. So just one last time, I think that Nusantara is an interesting and important approach to trying to find a way to preserve local and more global at the same time. I didn't say anything about globalization, and I would like to, but I should stop talking, I think. But we can talk more about globalization. It's very much the context here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to ask you a question. Does local by your definition is what your experiencers or what is the place that your birthplace is? Because I think we have the same kind of experience because you were born in America but live in France. So does local mean to you that your birthplace or does it by your experience? Because I think because you know you are in France, so that's your closest, but you are on birth in America.
Thanks. That's a great question, and I don't want to speak too much about my own psychology, but I can say a little bit. So, so now I am a French citizen, and the word that they use in France for becoming a citizen is called naturalization, naturalisation. Natural, meaning that my nature has changed when I become a French citizen. This is a metaphysically very interesting idea that somehow I became a different kind of person when I accepted and signed a document saying that I became French. So as a American now living in, and now I guess I am also French at the same time, psychologically this is complicated. When people ask my children, for instance, do they feel more American or more French? This happens a lot because when they speak to people, people do not know that they are American. They speak, their French sounds like they could have been born in France because they have lived there for 10 years. And children learn foreign languages more easily than adults. I only learned French 10 years ago because I really wanted to live in France, but it was harder for my children. They didn't do any work. They say they feel more French than American, and I think that must be right. But how is it that we can hold two different identities at the same time? One of the reasons that I'm so interested in what Descartes had to say about mathematics, this is going to sound like a strange answer. We're speaking about identity and I'm speaking about mathematics, but this is just how I think. Descartes had this idea that really mathematics in algebra and geometry were the same thing. We just couldn't see it that way until he did his work. So that there was a kind of underlying identity that was a fusion of algebra and geometry. And I'm interested in this idea, the idea that there exists what you could call fusions or hybrids, new kinds of things that exist in between pre-existing local places, so that from a local place and another local place, we can find sometimes a new local place. So all this time I am speaking of Indonesia as though it is a thing. But what is this thing? It is so many islands, so many cultures, and yet there is some unity to it. This is a hybrid notion. The nation of Indonesia is a unity in diversity, as the Garuda says. The same thing is true for me. I think that I am a unity in diversity of two different identities. This is a reason why I think the debate that I tried to talk about today between localisms and more globalisms is so interesting, because not only does it play out in terms of our economic choices, in terms of our linguistic choices, and in terms of our mathematical choices, but it also at the same time has political consequences. And I think it goes the other direction too. Our politics affects our preferences in language, our preferences in mathematics, and our preferences in shopping. So I think that we are learning in the world today how to live with many different unities, many different identities at once. And, but we are learning. This is something that is new. It's part of the context of globalization, but not only. It's part of the context of post-colonial societies, but not only. Everyone with more travel is learning to try to live in different worlds together, and even within the same person. And I think that the idea of what is local is being transformed both as we speak in terms of politics and culture, but also with respect to language, as the example of the Indonesian language shows you, a new language that is a way of fusing Malay, Dutch, other colonial languages, and also with respect to mathematics, where we see with Descartes the invention of his new algebraic geometry, again a kind of hybrid or fusion. So I'm very interested in hybrid objects more generally in these different kinds of domains. So thank you for a wonderful question.
Thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Andrwarana, I want to ask about something. This has a relation with your paper about imagination on mathematics. So maybe we can say that local things in Greek's mathematics, like Ploccus, about imagination is approaching on the ideal things on Neoplatonics. Yeah, and I want to ask about, so now we said the mathematics is only on proof things, like we just get rid all the culture things, like on Pythagorean in Pythagorean philosophy, we know that something like number is sacred, like that's a cut thing, and the in Pythagorean views, so also that geometry can be translated and on arithmetic, but an irrational number they can answer it, right? So I want to ask about how important locality on mathematics right now, because right now a mathematician, logician just suggest that mathematics is just universal thing, like proof things, though there is something like pluralism on mathematics. You know, we use intuitionistic logic, we use paraconsistent logic to know something that we can see on classical logic, like Russell paradox. It can allow on, it can be alone on paraconsistent logic, of course. And yeah, I want to ask about how important is the local things right now. Just we get rid of all that things, or like.
No, thanks a lot. That's a very good question, and one that I think has a lot of things that I can say. So you're absolutely right that one of the ways that unity in mathematics seems to come about, or kind of universalism, is because some people have this idea that mathematics should be known through the mind, and that the mind works by imagination. And what Kant teaches us is that the imagination has two different kinds of forms, that we can know the world with respect to space, and we know the world with respect to time. And those two intuitions of the world are primitive. That is, every rational being has the same way of seeing the world, shaped by space, shaped by time. And those two primitive intuitions give us mathematics, but they also then give us science, and they give us ethics, and they give us art. All of those originate, according to Kant's critical philosophy, in the idea that we have these two primitive intuitions which are shaped through the imagination. Now, in mathematics, what this leads us to say is some people will think then that all mathematics should be the same for every rational being because we all have these two forms of intuition. And one of the things that I am moving towards in the work that I talked to you about today is thinking about localism in mathematics as a resistance to this Kantian idea that there is something uniform in the way that we understand mathematics. One concrete example that I mentioned before that I traveled to Japan a lot because I have a project on, in Japan, there was a mathematician named Takeuchi who was working in proof theory in the 20th century. In fact, he was at the same university that I was in when I was in the United States, but he was dead before I arrived. So we were both at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I was professor and he was professor. And Takeuchi was a Japanese man who came to the United States, like many Japanese after Second World War. And his conception of, he believed that in logic, we could prove the consistency of arithmetic using finite methods. This is something that Gödel had seemed to show was impossible because to prove the consistency, that is, that there are no mistakes in our reasoning about arithmetic, Gödel argued we needed to use infinitary thinking, that we needed to use the infinite knowledge to understand finite knowledge. What Takeuchi shows in his mathematics, I think, is that Gödel believed that the infinite could not be used to prove something about the finite, because we know the finite in a very close way, but the infinite we don't know, because God is infinite and we cannot know anything that's infinite. But Takeuchi argues that we can prove something, we can prove good things about what is finite by using what is infinite, because in fact the infinite and the finite are connected together. And that's, I argue, because in the Buddhist understanding of the world, the infinite and the infinite and the finite interpenetrate. They pass between each other. And in Japanese philosophy, we find many ideas of the interaction between infinite and finite. This is expressed in the Buddhism of Japan. And Takeuchi gives a very formal, very logical approach to this, and he becomes one of the great logicians of the 20th century in applying this Japanese understanding of the infinite to mathematical logic. So finally then, to show you why that's relevant to your question, it's because it undermines the thought that there is just one way of thinking about the infinite, about thinking about number in mathematics. If Kant is right, there is only, the imagination is formed by one kind of intuition, or two kinds really, space and time, and our intuitions of both are finite. Takeuchi uses philosophy from the Kyoto school of philosophy called a concept called active intuition. And this is a kind of intuition that allows us to have knowledge of the infinite in an intuitive way. And Takeuchi uses this to prove consistency of arithmetic. So we can have intuitive knowledge of the infinite in this Buddhist understanding. That's very different than the Kantian understanding. And for that reason, we can see local approaches to even mathematics will give us different results. As you pointed out, in the case of intuitionism and paraconsistency, we already know things like this. But I think it goes even further than this, that there are different philosophical choices we make when we're doing our mathematics and our logic, like how we think of the infinite, that can be understood locally. And until now, everyone accepted Kant as the final answer because they didn't know that there were other approaches to the infinite that exist in non-Western, so non-Judeo-Christian Islamic conceptions, but rather in Buddhist conceptions. So I don't mean here to try to convince you that I'm right about this or that the Buddhist conception is the right conception about the infinite, but rather to point out that these issues I'm talking about localism, affect even the areas of mathematics that you were talking about in your question, about the uses of logic in mathematics. So yeah, thanks for all that. I'm sorry I went off on a lot of things, but that's the answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe this is the final question because we run out of time. Yeah, with this localism in mind, I'm just wondering your philosophical stance that you want to promote in your philosophical view. With localism, are you trying to promote kind of pluralism in mathematics? And if you want to promote like mathematical pluralism, what kind of pluralism? Is it theoretical pluralism, or maybe inside of the theory itself there are so many like methodological pluralism that you also want to promote? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's also extremely pertinent question, because pluralism now is a big topic in philosophy, and it can mean many things. So in ethics, we will talk about ethical pluralism. In religion, we will talk about religious pluralism. What I'm interested in especially is epistemic pluralism, which is to say that there are different ways of knowing. There are different ways of knowing. I was going to say different ways of knowing the world, but even the world is a concept that is complicated. So epistemic pluralism would say that, in the way that I'm understanding it, is that we each bring our perspective as knowers to what we know. I think that this is now a widely accepted point of view in many different domains, but particularly in logic and mathematics, this strikes people, as the last question pointed out, as strange. It seems that how could I have a different perspective for knowing mathematics than someone else? And the Kantian answer is trying to give us, no, it's all inside of me, so everyone knows the world in the same way. What I think is, with the kind of epistemic pluralism that I'm interested in, that I'm moving towards, is something more like what we would call, in a kind of Nietzschean way, a perspectival localism, a perspectival way of knowing, so that everyone knows according to their perspective. But if you want but that sounds like a kind of relativism. But here is again a kind of link with Nusantara. I think that it is not only that, because what Nietzsche tells us that to know is to know in the most ways possible. He tells us this, for instance, in the genealogy of morality, that knowledge from one perspective is not enough. We should try to know in as many different ways as we can, and only with that can we come to know anything in the best way. He tells us by the example of a tree. He says, if we look at a tree from only one angle, we will only see the tree. We will only understand the tree in a limited way. But if we can learn to see the tree in many different ways, then we will have a more full understanding of the tree. And Nietzsche says this is true more generally, that to know anything, we need to learn to know it from many different perspectives. The problem is that it's hard to take on many different local perspectives. And this is related to many of the questions that have been posed today. For me, one of the reasons to try to become a more global person, but at the same time preserving local identities, is to learn to have the power to transform yourself into different local perspectives, to become not only American, but also French, to become not only Javanese, but also to become Indonesian, to learn to see the world in different local ways. And only then will we have the fullest kind of knowledge that we can have. So when I talk about epistemic pluralism, that's what I mean. It's a kind of summation of local perspectives gives us the fullest kind of knowledge. There's also metaphysical things that go along with this, but I don't want to get into that too much right now. But thank you for your perceptive question.
Well, thank you for Mr. Arana. And we will still have another lecture that will begin at 10. So teman-teman peserta bisa duduk dulu di sini. Kita 10 menit lagi ya. Nanti pas jam 10 kita mulai kuliah yang kedua.
Keja. Keja kan duduk di sana. Ja. Udah di jangan nanti dia pulang.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Rona told me that I could start, so I'm just going to jump right in. I'll introduce myself. My name is Brian Earp. I'm a very new associate professor of philosophy, psychology, and biomedical ethics at the National University of Singapore. Before that, I was living in England for a number of years, and I was sort of beginning to adopt a British identity. But I also was born in the United States, in Seattle. So I'm very interested in the interplay between local and global. Another name that comes to mind is Kwame Anthony Apaya's work on cosmopolitanism, where he says it's not so much that you want to be a citizen of the world that's unmoored from your own local history, but your local history informs the way that you're a citizen of the world, and your worldliness can also feed back into your local context. So wonderful ideas that you were just sharing. I'm going to be talking about something very, very different. So we're going to change topics completely. I'm specifically going to talk about two ideas that are usually discussed separately. So the first idea has to do with the ethics of life extension, on the one hand. And by this I mean the use of medical and scientific technologies to try to radically extend the average human life beyond potentially even currently natural limits. There's also a more modest form of life extension which just seeks to extend our lives by some substantial amount so that the average in different countries, for example, raises up significantly. So that's the first idea, and we'll come back to that in a second. The second idea has to do with artificial intelligence, which many people are thinking about now. And the reason why many people are thinking about it is because of the recent release of these large language models from OpenAI was the first and most prominent one. So how many people here have played around with ChatGPT or a similar kind of large language model, just in your own experience? You just raise your hand if you've had any experience with a large language model. Okay, you seem almost shy to put up your hands. It's okay, I play around with these models too. So what I'll want to say about this is that these models, you can get them generally from the companies and use them to produce work, if you like. But it's also possible now, and pretty easy, to do what is called fine-tuning on the models. So you can train the models on more specific information, and that can be a specific area of research, for example. But you can also train a model on facts about and writing produced by a particular individual, a particular person. And you can give a model data about a particular person so that the model almost comes to be a digital replica of that person. It can encode their beliefs, their preferences, their values, their writing style. These can also be done in a multimodal way where you can sample their speech patterns. You can create a deep fake of a person where you have a visual representation of them that's melded to this linguistic representation of them. And so in effect, you're able to create a digital twin of a person. And actually, before I gave this talk this morning, as I was coming here, I was thinking that twin is not the right word. So I'm going to use a different word, and let me explain why I think twin is not the right word. So when you have a human twin, a biological sibling, they share certain biological features with you, certain genetic features with you, but their mental life is different. They have a different seat of consciousness. They have a different mental history. They see the world differently from the very moment of birth. What I'm talking about in digital twins, which I'll now call digital duplicates or digital replicas, is almost the exact opposite of that, or the inverse of that. So a digital replica shares your mental life to some extent, but doesn't share any biological features with you, right? So you see how it's the opposite of a biological twin. And so I'm now thinking to myself, I shouldn't use the language of twin because it's misleading. This is really a digital duplicate of your mental life or certain features of your mental life, certain features of your psychology. So this is the second idea that I'll come back to. And I'll try to see if there's a way of relating these two ideas and whether some interesting philosophical insights might emerge. Okay. So let's come back to the notion of life extension. I looked up some statistics on the plane on the way here, and the statistic I was interested in was the average lifespan for men and women in Indonesia. And it turns out it's a little bit different for men and women, and this is quite common in many countries. Women tend to live longer than men, as it happens. So I just want you to guess, or perhaps you know, what do you think is the average human lifespan for women in Indonesia? If you take the average of all these diverse cultures and islands and so forth, and you sum it together and create this statistical object of the average for women, does anyone know about what that is? You can make a guess. Who's brave enough to try? Yes, okay. What's your guess? Yeah, it's about 70, give or take, you know, a few decimal points. Okay, and does anyone have a guess for the average lifespan for men, for males in Indonesia? You already know it's going to be less than 70, so that's a tip for you. Any guess? Do you have a guess? I saw your eyebrows raise in anticipation, like you maybe have a guess. 65, yeah, it's 66, about 65, yeah. So maybe the first puzzle for life extension is to see how to extend the life of men to get a little higher, maybe a little more towards equality with women. Now, here's the first point about why philosophy matters for questions of life extension, among many other questions in society. Life extension is partly a scientific or a technical problem. And that's a very complicated problem, and a lot of people are working on pill. So let's set aside the limitations of technology and just focus on the moral question. Let's say that you could extend your own life by some amount by taking this pill tomorrow. So for men, you have an average expectancy of 65, for women about 70. Let's say that we could get men and women up to 85. How many people would want to take this pill to allow you to live until you were 85 instead of 65 or 70? Interesting, okay. So the Americans in the room are interested in extending our lives through magic pills. So I'm curious, it seems like almost everyone is either reluctant to share that they want to take a magic pill, or you don't want to take this magic pill. you're happy to have a lifespan of about 65 or 70 and sort of pass away at that time. So does somebody want to share why you feel this reluctance, why you don't like the idea of this pill? I'm genuinely very curious. There's no right or wrong answers. You can just share whatever your view is. Yeah, Tariq. Say that? The world is getting worse. Right, that's good. So one aspect of thinking about ethical questions is always to put them in the context of the wider social, cultural, political, geographical, existential type questions. Do you think that this is a trajectory that is very likely to continue, or do you think that there's a possibility of reversal? Maybe society gets so confronted by the deterioration that's happening in some respects that we turn around and we aim for a more optimistic future. Do you think that's possible, or are you more of a pessimist? I hear some pessimism. Okay. It's very interesting. There is something about the American culture that's stereotypically more optimistic, that's always striving to see how things can be made better. So maybe that's why Andrew and I are thinking we might like to take this pill. You know, by many metrics, the world is getting better. So in terms of infant mortality rates, life expectancy is growing in many countries, often due to better health care and resources. There are some aspects in which we're confronted by the worst of the world because of the way that media works. And media tends to focus on things that are likely to grab our attention. And the things that grab our attention are things that are depressing or shocking or outraging. And so when you scroll on social media or you watch the news, you tend to have your mind taken over by the things that are not working very well. But we should, speaking of epistemology, what do we know and how do we know? Our informational context is pre-selected for us. We don't have a direct access to all the world's knowledge that's unfiltered by the interests of media companies or governments, for example. So there are some debates about this, but by many objective measures, the world is getting increasingly better in terms of core categories that we might care about, like the ability of infants to survive into childhood and go on to adulthood, the ability of people to have enough food to eat, and have a place for shelter. There are many exceptions to this, and we tend to focus on the exceptions, but the overall trajectory is one of significant increase over time. So does that change your answer at all? Once you learned that on many measures the world's objectively getting better, does that make you want to maybe live longer, Tariq? Okay, all right. So this is a fact-sensitive opinion that you have. It's premised on certain understandings of the world. If those understandings change, you're willing to change your preference. Okay. So many governments are investing in research programs to try to extend the human lifespan. And one thing that they have to consider is how much to prioritize those investments compared to other ways they could be spending that money. So one of the ethical questions that I'll be focusing on is the question of trade-offs and alternatives. Whenever we're thinking about how much we should invest in one type of project, we have to consider not just in the abstract, how much would we like to pursue that aim, but we have to think about what are the trade-offs, what are the alternatives. What are we not investing in if we invest in life extension, for example? And one debate that people have about this is whether we should be focusing on trying to extend the lifespan of future generations, because it's not going to happen immediately. Probably in our lifetimes, we're not going to have significant lifespan extension. It might be for the next generation or the next generation. In other words, we're pursuing a technology that if it stands to benefit anyone, it's going to benefit people who don't exist currently, people who will exist in the future. So one philosophical question is, how much of our resources that we have today should we spend on trying to improve the quality of life of currently existing people versus how much should we invest in trying to make the world more hospitable to future generations, to our children or our children's children, or our children's children's children. And what's interesting about them is that they don't exist. So it's a real question about how we should shape our priorities. You might think that somehow actually existing people should be given more moral consideration than future potential people or possible people. On the other hand, that kind of temporally constricted thinking can also seem very irresponsible. You know, we could burn through all of our resources and fail to address serious problems like climate change and leave the world much worse for our children and our children's children. And many people feel that we have responsibilities to those who come after us, even though they don't exist. So that's a philosophical question about the nature of the duty that we may have to people who don't yet exist. So that's one trade-off I want us to consider, is the use of resources to try to help future generations versus the use of resources to try to improve the quality of life of people who exist today. But here's another aspect of the puzzle that I think philosophy can help to illuminate, and that is the why question. Why might anyone want to live longer? Now that they've been equipped with this knowledge that the world's getting better, so maybe more of you will want to live longer, what do you think is the reason for that? What would be the motivation? Just think from an individual perspective. So let's set aside governments making social policies. Let's think of an individual human life. Let's say that you are 64, Tariq, and so you know you're coming up on the average end of a lifespan for men in Indonesia. And now I offer you this magic pill, and I say, I can get you, 10 more years. And let's say that you're in reasonably good health, you have a good quality of life, but, it might be that you have a heart condition or something that causes you to die suddenly. But I can say, I'll give you this pill, and it will ensure that that doesn't happen for 10 years, unless some other accident occurs. So what would be some reasons that you or anyone who might be in this position, why might you want to take the pill? Or imagine you're an American, and you're just very optimistic about the future. Just put yourself in their shoes. What do you think would be a reason for wanting to extend your life? Why would you want to live longer? And again, it's just a brainstorming session. You're doing this philosophy with me. I don't have a correct answer I'm going to try to quiz you on. Yes? Huh? Family? So, your family might miss you. Many of you, I'm sure, have lost relatives, and sometimes that's very sad. Now, sometimes we feel, especially if somebody's been suffering, or they've lived a very full life, and it feels like there's diminishing returns or something like that, we might think, it's their time. It's okay for them to go, and we should learn how to grieve. But, our practices around grief are partly contingent on the fact that we typically die at a certain age. But if we didn't typically die at a certain age, maybe we would think there was something unfortunate about passing away at the ripe young age of 65. So our family might miss us. We might have obligations to our family that it's harder for us to fulfill if we don't exist anymore, or if we exist in some other metaphysical plane. So family is a good one, and I'm going to come back to that example. And you had an idea. Say that again? Unlimited desires. Okay. So later, I think we're going to have a podcast interview about theories of well-being. And so I've been thinking about different theories of well-being. And one major theory is a theory of desire satisfaction. So you can have a very simple theory of well-being, which just balances pleasures and pains. If you have generally more positive experiences in life than negative experiences, maybe that's one view of what well-being consists in. But on some more sophisticated views, well-being also, or instead, consists in having desires fulfilled, things that you really want and care about. Now, some of our desires are maybe very trivial. I have a desire for ice cream. I typically always have a desire for ice cream. But, if there was no ice cream, I think I would still have lots of well-being, because there are deeper desires that I have, including desires to care for my family. That's an example of a desire. I have a desire to try to contribute positively to the world. So another dimension that I want to raise here is that sometimes people want to leave a legacy in some sense. They want to finish a project that they hope will have value for others, for the community, or for their family, maybe even for how they are remembered. Perhaps they have a more self-centered reason for wanting to leave something to the world. Probably some people have that motive. But I think many people may feel they're on the cusp of contributing something really important. Let's say that you're a cancer researcher and you feel that you're just on the cusp of coming to an important discovery that could lead to a treatment that could save many lives. You might feel it's very unfortunate if you can't complete this project because your life is cut short relative to what is possible with this, so far, magic pill that we're discussing. So some ideas that we have here are, we might have relational concerns toward our family. We might have legacy concerns. And since we're talking about well-being and preference satisfaction, on many views of what well-being consists in, there's a prerequisite for well-being, which is the having of conscious experiences of a certain type. So on some views, in order to be a candidate for well-being, you have to be able to feel, subjectively, at least pleasures and pains. So I'm going to propose a third potential reason people might want to extend their lives, which is simply the continued existence of their own consciousness. They might want to have more experiences. So one example I'll get us to think about is, Halley's Comet returns once in many, many years. I don't know the exact number. And it's this very spectacular event. And maybe getting to experience that subjectively, getting to gaze up on the sky and experience this celestial event, which only happens, once every many generations. If you know that that's going to happen in the next few years and you're on your deathbed, you might think it's unfortunate that you won't be around long enough to experience this amazing celestial event, just as one example. So, why is philosophy important here? If you have governments that are just investing resources in trying to extend our lives without really interrogating deeply why that might be a good thing to do, or possibly a bad thing, maybe we shouldn't invest our resources that way. But let's focus on possible advantages or benefits of this just for now. When we take a philosophical approach to this question, we start to consider whether there are underlying reasons that are maybe the true goals that we're trying to fulfill. So what I want to propose is, we probably are not interested in just merely extending our biological lives. I don't think that's the ultimate goal. Here's an example. Suppose you're in a coma, a permanent state of unconsciousness, and medical technologies that are very sophisticated can be used to keep you alive, biologically, for years and years and years in this permanent unconscious state. It's possible that somebody with very unusual preferences might have a preference to stay merely alive, but I think most people would feel, if I'm never going to regain consciousness, if I'm never going to participate in relationships with my family again, if I'm never going to complete the important life project that I've been working on and leave a legacy to the world, it's not clear that just extending my life is the goal. So one thing that I think philosophy teaches us about this case is people are probably more interested in extending their selves rather than their biological life. So what's a self? That's a big topic in philosophy. Descartes had some ideas about this. There may be different dimensions or aspects to ourselves. Sometimes in this talk I'll be speaking about our psychological life or psychological features that we have. And there are many science fiction type thought experiments where people have imagined over the years that we could separate our psychological life from our biological embodiment. Now, it's an open question whether that's possible. There are some views of consciousness according to which consciousness can only really emerge from platforms that are very like brains embodied in biological selves like we have today. But some people think that consciousness could possibly be scaffolded on top of some other type of platform, maybe a digital platform. Maybe you could upload the functional features of your brain or your mind onto a computer chip and exist in that form with subjective experiences. But these are very controversial views. So I'm going to come back to the idea of trade-offs and alternatives. what happens when we have to think about a second best option for pursuing a certain goal? And then how does that affect our decisions about how to allocate our resources? So now I'm going to get over to this idea about artificial intelligence and fine-tuning a model to create a digital duplicate of yourself. And hopefully in about 5 minutes you'll see why these are connected. But first I'm going to take a sip of water. 1 second. Okay, so together we came up with this idea that there are at least 3 things that people might really care about when they're talking about life extension. And with my colleagues, we've proposed in a paper recently that what people are really interested in is something like person span extension. Not lifespan extension, but person span extension. And it happens to be the case that you can only extend yourself as a person, in a traditional sense, if you extend your biological life. But that might not always be true. Also, you can ask a further question, which is, why do people want to extend their person span? And we came up with some examples. It might be that they want to continue to relate to their families, to meet certain familial obligations, or obligations to their friends or others in their community. So there might be relational reasons why people want to extend their person span, as we call it. There might be reasons that have to do with leaving a legacy. So we talk about having an impact on the world, hopefully a positive one. And then there's this third one I discussed, which is wanting to continue to have subjective experiences, to consciously take in the world, maybe because you want to view a beautiful celestial event that only comes around once every many generations. So by thinking about what we really want underneath lifespan extension or person span extension, we can start to see whether there might be other ways of at least partially meeting those goals that don't involve extending our biological lives. We can think about whether there are alternative policies we might pursue or alternative technologies we might invest in to help us with what the actual goals are, rather than a proxy for those goals. And so now I want to suggest that it's possible that a digital duplicate could help us meet maybe 2 out of the 3 goals that we're talking about. And just to get to the punchline and then build back up to this, most philosophers of technology are confident that large language models do not and cannot have subjective consciousness. So although they can mimic human linguistic behavior very successfully, I'd say the predominant view is that large language models don't have the infrastructure to support subjective consciousness. There's nothing it's like to be, to use Nagel's phrase, a large language model. So if what you want to do is to continue your subjective experience of the world, a large language model duplicate of you, I'm just going to assume, cannot help you with that, because it can't serve as a platform to host your consciousness going forward. That's debated. There are some philosophers who are radically proposing that at least future versions of large language models may very well acquire a subjective, phenomenal consciousness. There might be something it's like to be them. They might even one day be able to experience pleasures and pains, perhaps if they're integrated in with biological substrates. But for now, we're just going to assume that one of our 3 goals can't be met with a large language model. But I want to see whether it might help us with the other 2 goals, leaving a legacy and engaging in or caring for certain types of relationships after our biological life stops. So to tell you about this, I'll give you a personal story. This is a real thing that happened to me, which is that after ChatGPT was released, there were about 2 weeks where I was reading all these news articles of people suggesting that this amazing technology had come out, and I tend to be a little bit skeptical of these kinds of news articles. I'm familiar with the way that hype can often cause us to feel more excited about something than is really justified. But after enough reading of these articles, I thought, okay, I'll try to see what this new technology is all about. So I got access to ChatGPT, and I played around with it for a while, and I thought, oh, this is a significant advance over previous forms of artificially intelligent communicative entities, or chatbots, as I'll say. And I had a housemate named Sebastian Porsdam-Mann, who also happens to be a philosopher who's interested in technology. And he had the idea that we should maybe try to train one of these chatbots on all of my previous publications. Now, I'm very fortunate to have been able to be a writer and a philosopher for over a decade now, and I've accumulated quite a lot of publications. Writing that, because I work in ethics, explicitly encodes my values, my argumentation, my beliefs, certain deep preferences that I have for how the world should go. And so it turned out not to be very technically complicated. We were able to do this with the help of a research assistant. It took about a week. And the way we trained this model is we took the title and the abstract of a published paper, and we put that in as the prompt, and then we trained it to complete on the rest of the paper. So the model starts to learn the relationship between a short description of an idea and how I actually executed that idea on more than 100 examples of various papers. And we got to the point where we could then test our new model and see if it could generate new material in my voice, in my writing style, using reasons that I employ, reflecting values that I have argued for. And so the way we did this is we put in the title and the abstract of a paper that I have always wanted to write, but I just haven't got around to. I don't have enough time. In fact, I have many papers like this, ideas for papers that I just don't have the time to actually write. So we put in the title and the abstract, and then we just pressed go and asked the model to write a paper. And it had varying success. Sometimes it kind of came up with gobbledygook, and other times it came up with a pretty good example of a paper that might have taken me a month to write, and it would write it in, 1 minute or less. So this was very startling to us, because it wasn't just using ChatGPT to write a paper that sounds very generic, like the average of everything that's ever been published on the internet, which is basically what ChatGPT is trained on, is all human writing that it's been able to get access to for training. Here, because it was fine-tuned on my papers, the last few layers of the neural network were trained on my papers, the writing that was produced sounded a lot like me. But of course, this is basically a chatbot that has this capacity, so I can also talk to the chatbot, and I can ask it questions and engage with it. I can say, for example, what do you think I would want if X, Y, and Z happened? And see what it says. And it turns out it's learned my preferences and my values, so it can answer successfully. So just as one quick detour, I'm going to tell you about a possible use of one of these fine-tuned models in medicine, and then I'm going to come back to this idea of life extension. So after we trained this model, we were very ethically confused, and we thought, should we even be allowed to use this model? I mean, I can write a draft of a paper in 30 seconds that's pretty good. I'd have to edit it and fix it a little bit, but basically I could produce a publishable paper in a very short period of time based on just the abstract, which only took me so long to write. So what we did is we manually wrote a paper on the ethics of using fine-tuned language models to produce papers. So we didn't use the language model to do it. That would have been very meta. We just wrote it by ourselves. And so that was one paper. And we call this an automated, unique content generator or something like that, and it stands for AutoGen. So AutoGen is the name of our fine-tuned model, and we wrote a paper about the ethics of AutoGen. But as we were doing this, I had this other idea of a use to which this fine-tuned model, this personalized AI, could be put. And this has to do with a very common and very tragic healthcare situation. So the healthcare situation is this. Someone gets in a terrible accident, and they come into the emergency room, and they've suffered brain damage, and they are unconscious. And it's unclear whether they will regain consciousness, and it's unclear whether the investment of a lot of medical resources will ever allow them to have a good quality of life, even if their consciousness is regained. Sometimes in a situation like this, there's a clear medical answer to what should be done. Either it's obvious that you can treat the person and help them restore consciousness and have a good quality of life, and then as a doctor, you're ethically required to do that, unless they have a do not resuscitate order or something like that. Other times, it's clear that the situation is futile. There's really nothing you can do as a doctor to help this person. And in that case, it's unethical to continue to treat them because you're wasting resources to no good end. But other times, it's unclear what you should do. And often, it may have to do in part with a value judgment about how to balance these trade-offs. Investing resources, maybe you'll get quality of life. It's unclear what the person would want. And in the United States, which is a very individualistic culture, there's a clear ethical standard which is called the substituted judgment standard. And the family will be called in to help make this decision, but the family's job is to try to help the doctors understand what would that person want. So you're supposed to make a substituted judgment to respect their former autonomy. And the family comes in and they consult on this and they say, well, based on some conversations we had in the past, I assume that Brian would want every effort to be made to save his life. Or I know based on some of Brian's values that he feels he's lived a good life and he wouldn't want to waste medical resources, so he'd want to be allowed to pass away. But many families haven't had this conversation with the person, and so it really is unclear what they would want, and the problem is you can't ask them because they're not available. So this is a real challenge. Now, I recently moved to Singapore, and I've learned that in Singapore and China, and it may be the case in Indonesia as well, there are different medical ethical standards. Often it has to do with a familial judgment about what would be best for the family unit and for harmony within the family as a whole. But what I've also learned is that it's easy to stereotype Western versus Eastern ways of thinking about this situation. You know, Easterners are all interested in communality and groups, and Westerners are interested in individuality and selfishness. But of course, I also love my family and care about my family. I'm not only interested in individual autonomy. And I imagine that Indonesians and Singaporeans and Chinese also care to some extent about what would he or she want. It's not irrelevant to the decision. It's at least one factor that will influence the family decision. So here was the idea about how we could use a large language model. Suppose before you getting in this accident, you train a digital duplicate of yourself on your past medical decisions, on various other sources of writing that reflect your preferences and values. Maybe you even engage in a series of discrete choice experiments where you choose between different options and then the algorithm infers what your preferences and values must be based on the choices you've made. There are various ways you could train a model, various sources of data that you could use, and there's a conversation we could have about those details, but let's just assume you've successfully done this. So now you have a digital duplicate of yourself, a sort of Brian GPT, to use my own example. And now it's the doctors and the family are in the room, but also this little patient avatar is in the room as well, a digital duplicate of the patient. And so it seems like one thing you could do is just ask the digital duplicate of the patient, what would you want to have happen in this situation? And if it's been successfully trained to extract the values and preferences of the patient, it might be that that's an important source of information that should go into the decision-making process. Okay. So we wrote a paper about what we call a personalized patient preference predictor, which we call P4 for short, so that we don't have to keep saying personalized patient preference predictor. And if you're interested in this particular use case, you can look up that paper. Okay, so now let's come back to the idea of life extension. We were thinking, once you've trained a model like this, you could probably use it for various things. You could use it as a patient preference predictor, but you could use it for other things as well. So I'm going to begin by focusing on the case of wanting to leave a legacy that we were talking about before, wanting to finish an important life project. And maybe you get a diagnosis of terminal cancer, and so you know you just are not going to be able to finish this project before you die, before your biological life stops. I want to propose a case where it might be that the use of a personalized large language model could help you fulfill posthumously, so after you die, a goal that you had and that was important to you while you were biologically alive. And the example that I want to use is, suppose you're a writer, you're a novelist, and you've been working for your entire adult life on this epic novel that you have good reason to believe will be an important thing to give to the culture, and that this is a novel you really believe in, and you've been pouring your heart and your soul into this novel for decades, let's say. And let's say you've written about 80% of this novel. And then you get the unfortunate news from the diagnosis that you only have 6 months left to live. So you know you're not going to be able to finish the novel. It's just impossible. Even if you put everything into it, it's not going to happen. So you use your final 6 months to write a very detailed outline of how you intend the final 20% of the novel to go, how you want the plot to resolve, how you want the novel to finish. And then you train a language model on all of your previous writings. So past novels, the first 80% of this novel, so that the model learns your writing style, your approach to character development, the way that you tend to pursue plot lines, and you can put in as a prompt the final 20% in outline form, so that you constrain the model to fulfilling the ends of the novel in alignment with your intentions. So the final thing you do before you die is you leave a note, a set of instructions to your spouse, let's say, or your family members, that says, when I die, it's really important to me that you put the outline into the large language model, and that's been trained on my past writing, so it knows my approach to writing. It writes in my writing style, and I want you to just press go and complete the novel. And whatever it comes up with for the final 20%, I want you to publish in my name. So I can imagine a few responses, and I'm curious about your take, and I'll wrap up soon so that we can have a conversation together. You might think that the best way of fulfilling this legacy goal would be to write the novel yourself. Maybe that's the ideal. But in this case, the ideal isn't possible. So I'm now thinking in terms of what's a second best option. And I'm proposing that using a large language model that intimately represents your approach to writing and character development and plot lines, that's further constrained by a detailed outline reflecting your intentions for how the novel should go, can at least count as a second best way of fulfilling this underlying goal, the sort of goal that people may have when they're pursuing life extension. If only I could live for another 3 years, then I could finish the novel. But you can't live for another 3 years. But you can train a large language model. So what do you think about this case? Suppose you're a novelist. Would you be interested in using a language model to try to finish this particular life project? How many people think it would at least partially count as a fulfillment of this important life goal? Nobody appreciates this idea. Maybe you need to think about it more. Maybe it's just not a very compelling example. So you would prefer that the novel just goes unfinished. It stops at 80%, and that's it. Is there anyone in this room who would prefer to complete the novel? This is very interesting data for me. Okay, there's one person. What is your view on using the model to try to finish your life goal? Yeah, that's a very interesting reflection. It occurs to me that there are some historical examples, and I wish I could think of a specific one to share, but I know there are examples of philosophers and novelists who have a very close working relationship with a spouse, usually, a partner, a life partner, who knows them intimately. And they will sometimes entrust the job of finishing, based on their notes, a work of philosophy, for example, to this person who knows them very well. And one option is that they could just maybe, like Hitchens, just say, yeah, I have these notes, I have these ideas, they're unfinished, just publish what I finished. It's very important that I be the one who's responsible for every word on the page. But historically, there are some people who seem to be comfortable with the second best option, which is they trust someone to help them fulfill their vision for an argument or set of ideas or a plot line or whatever it is. And this is because they think that person knows them intimately and can accurately represent their values, their writing style, their preferences, their intentions, and so forth. So one thought I have is that some of the skepticism in this room might be due to a thought that a large language model can't actually accurately represent your preferences, your values, your writing style, and so on. And I'll just say that that was what I thought too before I trained a large language model on my own writing. And I was shocked at how it was able to represent my writing style, my reasoning, my preferences, my values, and so forth. So one hypothesis I'm going to float is that if you ever have a fine-tuned language model that accurately represents you, you might change your minds. You might think that this is a way of fulfilling, at least partially or as a second best way, one of these important life goals. Okay, the last example, because I've been going on for a while, has to do with relational considerations, like Rona was raising. So there's now an explosion in the use of what some people call grief bots. And a grief bot is a large language model that's fine-tuned on all the writing, so it can be emails or text messages, of somebody who has recently passed away who you love. And there are a range of views about this technology, but let me just describe sort of how it works and what it looks like for a person. So let's say you have someone in your life whom you love dearly, your partner, your spouse, your best friend, and every day you're messaging with them regularly, sharing your ideas and thoughts and jokes and what happened and so forth. And, you know, they acquire an illness. Let's say when they're very young, long before they, in some sense, should die, they die. And you have this sudden aching loss of a person who has been central to the way you live in the world and your daily habits and routines and how you make sense of things. And all of a sudden, you send a text message to them and you forget that they can't reply, that they aren't there anymore. Some people, using this new technology, have responded to this situation by training a chatbot on all of the written material of their deceased loved one, and then they'll, in some sense, continue the conversation. So they send a message, and they get a response that's indistinguishable from the response or a type of response that their loved one would have given. Now, some people might find this to be rather grotesque. Look, if someone dies, what you need to do is simply grieve their loss and move on. They're not coming back. You shouldn't be trying to hold on to them so tightly. But I think that type of response might be a little bit too quick, because of course there are many ways we try to hold on to the ones we love in our memories. Through ceremonies, through looking at their old pictures, through reading their writing. Perhaps we read their old text messages to try to recall them to our memory and imagine what it's like to interact with them. We might have a simulated conversation with them just using the resources of our imagination. So I think it's not quite right that when someone that we love dies, we just try to sort of grieve and move on as quickly as possible. There are ways of failing to grieve someone that can prevent us from forming meaningful new relationships with others. So you can imagine becoming perfectly obsessed with this deceased loved one such that you don't engage with the world anymore. And that seems like there's reasons to think that's probably not ideal. But at least some amount of continued engagement with the memory of the person, I think, is consistent with many people's intuitions of what it can look like to healthily grieve the loss of someone. So one potential use of a large language model is, suppose you know you're going to die soon because you have a diagnosis, and you decide with your partner that you're going to create a digital duplicate of yourself that they can continue to talk with after you die. So, again, I'm curious, and I have a suspicion that many of you will think this is a horrible idea. So let's try to understand the reasoning behind your skepticism. So you nodded your head vigorously. Why do you think that you would be not at all interested in being able to continue a conversation with a digital duplicate of a loved one? So let's just think of a loved one in your life. I mean, pick a person that you care about very deeply. Give me their initials. Okay, you're just going to go straight for the answer. All right, what's different? Go ahead. Okay, so it sounds like your skepticism is coming from a doubt about the capacities of the technology. Okay. You might have to take my word for it, because I've spent a lot of time with this technology, but it is currently technologically possible to create a digital duplicate of a person that is very realistic and that very carefully mimics their idiosyncratic style, their speech patterns, the sorts of jokes that they tell, and you can explicitly encode shared memories into these models in various different ways. Either you can feed in all the memories that already exist in the emails you've exchanged with them or the text messages. What are text messages? They're often recording memories, right? Here's what happened today. So that becomes explicitly accessible to the model. It can refer back to that text message. It can say, hey, remember that thing that happened that one day? So this is, again, very useful information for me, that a lot of your skepticism is not necessarily about the idea of a digital duplicate. It's that you just don't think it's possible. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce one concept, and then maybe I'll wrap up so we can have the open questions. How many people have heard of the computer scientist Alan Turing, a British computer scientist? Okay. There's something that in philosophy and in computer science we now call a Turing test in honor of Alan Turing, which was his proposed test for when we would decide that a computer was intelligent or had human-level intelligence. And he imagined an experiment where you have two computer screens, let's say, side by side, and then there's a sort of wall separating you from whoever's behind the computer screen. So in one case, it's a person who's just having a conversation with you, let's say by typing. And in the other case, it's just the computer is talking with you using its own technology. And you're supposed to guess, after engaging and testing these different conversation partners, you ask them various things, you push back on claims, you see how they respond. You're supposed to guess which one's the computer and which one's the human. And Turing's idea, I'm giving a simplified version of it, is if it ever gets to the point where you guess at about chance levels, where you're just as likely to be right as wrong, then the computer will have passed the Turing test. It will behave in a manner that's indistinguishable from what a human who is intelligent would behave under those circumstances. And so already it's the case that large language models, just generic ones, can pass the Turing test. And this might be one of the first examples of a computer technology that passes the Turing test. The large language models outstrip human intelligence in certain types of ways. But the idea here is that there would be something called a personalized Turing test. So instead of just a random human and then a computer, it would be, your loved one is behind one computer screen, and a fine-tuned, personalized large language model trained on all of their linguistic output that they've ever produced that's in written form is trained over here. I'm just going to stipulate that a large language model can pass a personalized Turing test, meaning that if you didn't know if it was your loved one or the computer, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference just from typing. So I want you to use your imagination to overcome your skepticism about the capacities of these technologies, and just imagine that the chatbot can pass this personalized Turing test, so that if you didn't know that it was a chatbot, you would think it was your partner. By the way, people are already using chatbots to mimic people for criminal purposes. So you can take a sample of someone's voice and train it on text that you can get from the internet, maybe their YouTube videos, you download the transcripts and you train a model with it, and then you can impersonate them extremely accurately so that actually their family members don't know it's not them. And then you can ask them to give over your bank details, right? So it's very important that we understand the capacities of these technologies, because if we don't believe that technologies can accurately mimic a real person, then we'll be giving our bank details out to criminals. So I stipulate and I insist that these models can accurately imitate individual persons in a highly successful way. So given that that's true, and now you imagine that the person you love the most in the world suddenly passes away, and let's say that they've already trained this model on all of their written material that reflects and encodes their values, their speaking style, and so forth. I wonder how many people here would be tempted to at least try to have a conversation with this model, just one time. Okay, a few hands are coming up. All right, I've lowered the bar low enough that you're willing to consider this possibility. So I admit that I would be very curious to try this. Final story here, and then we'll conclude. My best friend in real life passed away about 2 years ago now, and he was a prolific writer. Interestingly, he didn't publish any writings, but he wrote these long emails that would reflect, months of insights and readings he'd done and adventures he's gone on, and his writing very specifically captured his personality. Every time you read an email from Matthew, you really get a sense of him behind the writing. And so just this summer, I went to go visit his widow, and she was in the process of, she'd hired an archivist to go through emails and written diary entries and notes, academic notes and so forth, to create a kind of searchable library of his text as a way of remembering him and honoring his writing, which is a reflection of his mind and a reflection of who he is. And he died very young, when he was just 37, of a form of cancer. And Berta, his widow, asked me just offhandedly what I was working on these days as an academic topic. And I sort of said, oh, well, there's these personalized large language models, and I was kind of giving this example. And it struck both of us in the middle of the conversation that it would be technically very easy to create a realistic duplicate of her deceased husband and my deceased best friend. And this gave us chills because we were very conflicted. So I just want to confess that I myself did not think this is a straightforward good. And one of the tests that we used to decide whether to make one, and we haven't made one, is what would Matthew want? So this is just to bring us back to that substituted judgment standard. We asked, would he consent to having his psychological life represented in the form of a fine-tuned language model? And our provisional conclusion is that he probably wouldn't want to exist in that form. And so we've used that way of thinking as a initial ethical thought for how we might make a decision about whether to create these things, as a minimal criterion, asking, would the person want to be encoded in this form? So I'll leave you with that real story, and thank you for your time, and let's now open up to questions. I don't know, is there a microphone I should pass around? Or just speak loudly, maybe people can hear.
Check. Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your time. I would like to bring a point first. Professor, you bring a good point about that the limits upon AI and this large language model. I think personally it will definitely be beyond how we would perceive today. And I think you are correct on saying that if can mimic someone, I think that is the reality that we are living in right now. You have maybe towards a skeptic, but also some optimistic view on that. But I am interested in how ethically does this AI language model affect on our society? Because I will give my perception on this. When I was seeing on social media and also some friends on how they interact with AI, I can conclude that AI is actually good in the sense of the academic and for the working force, for improving our societal norms or how that we do our work, because it brings efficiency and it also brings more efficiency and better results in that level. But I think it will be ethically very bad for our society. Like, for example, like a lot of young men that have anime waifus, that they would just be lonely, never have a girlfriend, and they would talk to an AI that is like their girlfriend, something like that. And also, I think that ethically it's just quite dangerous when we put AI, that the original purpose is as a tool, right? But when we put it so intrinsically in our interpersonal relationship towards each other, I think it's quite disastrous for society, where like this is we can say it, our loved ones die, and we train our AI language model to perceive them. Then the problem is in just modern society today, and in not even before AI even was born, there's always have a question of existentialism and what is real in the world. And I think when there's something that if humanity doesn't know what is real in the world, then plus add on with AI, plus again, how can we know what is real? When humanity can say we don't know what is real, it's kind of disastrous for humanity in the long term. I want to know your thoughts, Professor. Thank you.
That was a very insightful comment, and I'll share a few thoughts, and I'm curious also what the rest of you feel. So there's a distinction that sometimes people draw between what are called outcome goods versus process goods. And it sounds like you're intuitively identifying a similar type of distinction. It seems like there are some benefits we could bring to society if we're thinking in consequentialist terms. We could improve the efficiency of the reports that we file at work and, I don't know, increase the economy or something like that if we use these tools. And maybe that seems like a good thing if we set aside all other considerations. There's certainly some efficiencies that might be gained, and all else equal, doing something more efficiently might be a good thing. On the other hand, there are what are sometimes called process goods, which have to do with the way that we achieve a certain outcome. And this often has to do with things like whether we've done something with integrity, or whether there's an intrinsic value to how we pursue an end. So let me illustrate this with an extreme example. Let's say that you've always wanted to reach the summit of Mount Everest. On one approach, you get in a helicopter and you just ride it to the top. So there, you're at the summit. The outcome is achieved. On the other hand, suppose you train for months and months and you climb the mountain all the way to the top. The end point is ostensibly the same. You reach the top of the mountain either way, and in one way you even did it much more efficiently. You got there much more quickly and more safely as well. That seems like a good thing. But many people would have the intuition, and I certainly have the intuition, that something would be lost. Something would be lost about getting there in a helicopter rather than through the process of exerting effort and testing your will and so forth. So just as a general response to what you're saying, I think that you're right. We need to be very careful not only to think about consequentialist benefits that AI might bring us. And of course, AI technology companies have a great interest in emphasizing those very considerations. So when you look at any advertising material from any of the big AI companies, whether it's Google or whoever else, always you will find these very strong claims about the benefits that will be brought to society in terms of efficiency. They'll say we'll come up with drug discoveries that will enable us to cure cancers and so forth. And some of these claims, if they turn out to be true, are actually very significant benefits. I mean, suppose it's true that the use of an AI helps us more quickly discover treatments for diseases that cause the death of millions of people. That's not a trivial consideration. And in fact, it might be that even if we sacrifice some process goods in some domains, it might be that the benefits could be sufficiently great that that's a trade-off we're willing to accept. In other domains, you might think that we care much more about the process and that it have a certain type of integrity and that we get to the destination in a certain way. And I think when it comes to our close relationships, for example, that might be one of those areas where if we make it too easy to disengage from reality as we know it, because we have easy access to these imitators or pretenders of relationship partners, then the very process of what it's like to awkwardly get to know another person and have to respond to their real needs and vulnerabilities, which is what we require to have relationships with fellow humans who have needs and vulnerabilities. If we instead relate to an AI girlfriend who can pretend to have needs and pretend to have vulnerabilities, but there's some part of us that knows that, in some sense, she'll always be there for us, and she'll never tire, and she'll always respond in just the way that we hope she will. Now, to some people, maybe that sounds great, but to others, I think, rightly, it has a ring of a very tragic superficiality to it. Because part of what it is to love another human being is precisely to try to be responsive to their needs and vulnerabilities, and to hope that they will respect you in kind. But an AI model can't care about you. It can only pretend to care about you. It can only perform linguistic behavior that looks like what a caring person would say. So I think that we would lose something about the integrity of relationships if it was just too easy to try to replace certain relationships with AI. And I'm actually quite concerned about this and working on a project that's focused specifically on what we should say about AI models coming to fill certain social roles. So the classic case now is you might have an AI assistant, and you use it to help fill out a form at work or something like that for your increased efficiency. But as you rightly pointed out, these AI chatbots are increasingly being used and even designed to fulfill a range of more specific social roles that have historically only been filled by fellow human beings, like an AI companion that's sort of like a friend, or an AI girlfriend, or an AI mentor or teacher or coach. So those are being produced by the AI companies as well. And with fellow humans, we have a sense of intuitively what counts as a good relationship, what counts as a relationship that has integrity, because we've practiced these cooperative norms for different types of relationships for millions of years and shaped through our local cultures, to go back to the global-local distinction. When we have an AI that mimics human behavior, I can imagine this is going to create a psychological problem for us, because on the one hand, it's going to try to exploit our relational psychology to get us to keep using it, to seem familiar. So it will perform things like sadness, and then I'm going to feel maybe compelled to try to comfort the AI. But on the other hand, part of me will know that, or likely believe, that it doesn't have subjective states. It doesn't feel sadness. So that might make me feel sort of taken advantage of in a certain sort of way. Well, wait, why is it inducing me to try to respond with caring behavior, even though, unlike a human, it doesn't have needs? In humans, we're talking about the philosophy of emotions. Emotions serve certain functions. Often what emotions do is they signal mental states that encode needs that we're trying to communicate implicitly and automatically to a partner. So sadness communicates that you need some sort of care. Anger communicates that you feel you've been wronged and that there's a need to repair the relationship. So our emotions, when they're sincerely felt and communicated, communicate about our needs. If an AI pretends to have emotions, and pretends to have needs, even though it's inexhaustible and it never tires, unlike a real human, I do think that this is going to have very serious and potentially negative ramifications for our relationships. And just one final thought on this, because it's such a rich question that you've asked. You know, there are some people who have struggled their whole lives to form successful romantic relationships. And I'll use the example of men. In Japan, there's an overrepresentation of men who have no romantic partners and can't envision that they could ever acquire one. So you might think, well, that's just too bad. Some people in life, they just aren't able to find a friend or a mate, and they are destined to be very lonely, and to spend their days going home to their apartment. Maybe they're socially rejected or whatever. I'm imagining that for some such individuals, and there are, of course, women this way, and people of all genders who may feel this way, that being able to have a pseudo-relationship with an artificial intelligence could at least fulfill some of the needs that they have to feel companionship. You know, some people get pets, non-human animals, to help them fulfill some of their emotional needs. And so for some people who are really on the edges of society, who maybe don't have a human option for a relational partner, it's possible that it could be a benefit, almost like a therapeutic device for some such people that you might want to make available under those circumstances. The cases that I'm really worried about are people who, if only they put in the effort, they could form a meaningful human relationship with others, who then become incentivized not to put in the effort because they have this tempting alternative that always seems to cater to their needs and never seems to say no. So that segment of society I'm really quite worried about when it comes to the easy availability of AI that could, in some sense, try to represent certain relational roles. So thanks for your question, and those are my thoughts in response. Other questions or thoughts people wanted to raise? Yes.
Okay, thank you, sir. I wanna ask you about the digital duplicate. If it's really possible, are people gonna have it like one per individual, or it is just for some people that is important, or for the society, or maybe have some impact for the society? Because from the example that you give to us, it is always the novelists or writers that have the digital duplicate. So yeah, so I wanna know that what if that person doesn't have any particular or important goals for the society? Are they gonna have the duplicate, the digital duplicate or not? Thank you.
It's a good question, and I'll try to actually tie it back to another aspect of the previous question I forgot to mention, which is this question of reality versus inauthenticity or misrepresentation or confusion about what's real. So many people produce a lot of linguistic evidence that isn't necessarily in the form of a novel, insofar as they use text messages to communicate with their friends. So it isn't on each person to necessarily produce a significant benefit to all of society in the way that perhaps a great artist might. You know, everyone should aspire to contribute to society to the best of their ability. But let's suppose someone simply has tried their best and they haven't managed to produce something that has a significant social impact. Well, we still are embedded in networks of relationships that have meaning and value to us in our local level, even if we aren't having a global impact on the world. And I think these local community-based relationships between friends and family and parents and children and extended family and local business people, living out a life where you try to live those relationships with integrity, I think can be a meaningful life. And the little things that you produce that have meaning within that network of, of a community are meaningful for you. So the technology is such that really anyone will be able to create one. And so it certainly is likely to happen that people who are not artists and people who are not novelists will be able to, and probably many people will, create these fine-tuned models that try to duplicate them by training them on their text messages or their emails, for example. And I'm not sure what I think about that. I do want to come back to the question of what's real, so let me come back to that again. So I think many of us tend to think of the analog world as real and the digital world as somehow unreal or less real. And there's certainly ways in which people can impersonate someone without telling you that that's what they're doing, and then that's a sort of a form of deception. So if you have an AI that's mimicking someone for purposes of stealing your credit card information, there's a very straightforward sense in which you are failing to perceive reality. You mistakenly believe that the person on the phone line is your son, when actually it's an AI that's duplicating your son's voice to ask you for a bank transfer. So I think that that's a very serious ethical concern, and I think that, and it's partly why I suggest we have to be ready for the idea that there will be convincing digital duplicates, because they will be used by bad actors, and they are currently being used by bad actors. So the technology exists, and it's happening. But there's another question about what do we mean when we say something is real or not. So let's imagine that you're having a video conversation with a friend who lives in another country. So what you're interacting with really is just, a two-dimensional video screen with pixels, and you have an audio feed that's sort of encoding their voice in sound waves and being processed digitally. And, they're responding in real time, but you're not actually interacting with them in some analog form. You're looking at pixels moving around on a screen that are caused by things that they are doing. So you're not interacting with them, you're interacting with downstream consequences of actions that they're taking far, far away. But you might think that you're still having a real conversation with the person. So even though it's mediated through this digital form, certain aspects of what's going on are real. And the fact that they're mediated through a digital form doesn't make them less real, unless there's a very idiosyncratic notion of what we mean by real. Now take another example. Let's say you just have old video clips of that conversation, and now let's say the friend is no longer alive. And you miss them, so you go and you watch these video recordings of old conversations you had with them. Is there a sense in which it's unreal, what you're experiencing? Now it's true that there's no longer a seat of consciousness that's producing new behavior that's being encoded in a digital form and then affecting you on the other side. But I don't think that makes it less real. What you have is a recording of previous behavior that the person took that is meaningful, that has intent, that is related to a desire to communicate with you. But the key thing is it's important that you know it's a video recording. So here's where the real unreal thing comes in an ethically relevant sense, in my opinion. If you didn't know it was a video recording and you thought you were talking to your friend live, then you would be making a straightforward mistake. You would be mistaken about what was going on. So I don't think a video recording is less real than talking to someone in person. We just have to know what aspect of reality we're engaging with. We're engaging with a digitally encoded representation of the behavior of this person in the past. So I think that one ethical lesson for the development of digital duplicates is that it's crucial that we be aware, if we want to be in touch with reality, that it's a digital duplicate and that it isn't the person. And so this might affect ethical decisions about how these things are designed. It might be that the AI companies have to require that the model regularly remind you that it isn't conscious, regularly remind you that the person on whose data it is trained no longer exists, for example. And then the question is, if you engage with the model, are you engaging in an unreal interaction? I don't think so, as long as you know what you're doing. You know, and there's lots of ways, this is what's striking. So there's lots of ways that we live on after we die in various forms. We speak metaphorically about living on in our writings, in people's memories. The thing about a digital duplicate is that it creates new behavior that's based on information about the person. And that's the thing that we can't do without this technology. So I might live on in your memory, and your memory might change over time. I might live on in my writings, and you can go back to them, and maybe how people relate to them and the meanings they attribute to my writings might change over time. But if my writings then start to write new writings, that has never existed before in any form that I can think of. And so I think it's very puzzling philosophically what we should think about this and the extent to which we should think of it as a genuine reflection of the person, but in some new, sophisticated, digitally mediated form. I'm simply not sure. But I think these are exactly the questions that we have to ask and for which hopefully philosophy can make some contributions. Okay, other questions? Yes, back here in the white shirt.
Okay. Speaking about the realness of digital duplicate, I'm wondering about the ontological status of digital duplicate is quite important, because if we talk about maybe the human right and the subject of law of the digital duplicate, what do you think about that? If I have a digital duplicate and someone tried to do some kind of violence to my digital duplicate, would it be protected by the law, or is it granted by maybe human right or etc.? Thank you.
So I'm so pleased and impressed with the questions that you all are asking, because the questions you're asking are precisely the ones that at the very cutting edge of this field, philosophers are beginning to try to understand. So the legal status of a digital duplicate is very uncertain at this point. And in fact, although I follow this literature closely, I've only seen 1 or 2 papers where people have tried to systematically begin to answer that question. I'm not an expert in law, so let's try to think of the related ethical questions that hopefully the law in some way reflects or encodes. There is a prior literature on whether a person can be wronged when someone mistreats an avatar that they're using in a computer game. So computer game avatars have been around for a long time. So we have a little bit more literature on this phenomenon. So imagine you're playing a multiplayer game live with people connected through the internet, and you have a little action figure that represents you and that you're controlling with the controller. And maybe it's blue and has hair that's different from you. I mean, it doesn't necessarily look like you, but there's some sense in which it's your representative in this virtual world. And there are some cases where, and often there's a gendered angle to this, where a female player will undergo something that in the virtual world looks like an assault and violates the rules of the game or what the community norms are around how the other players should be treated. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, it isn't that she was assaulted because there's just pixels moving around on the screen. But on the other hand, many people have the intuition, and I share it, that there's some sense in which she is being wronged through the symbolic mistreatment of an avatar that represents her in that world. So I think a similar thing could be possible in the case of these digital duplicates. That, well, there's 2 ways of thinking about this. So we're talking about deontology, so I'm thinking of Kant and Kant's analysis of how we should treat animals and non-human animals. And Kant had the idea that animals did not themselves have intrinsic moral status such that we owed duties to them to treat them a certain way, because Kant had a very particular view about what grounds moral status, including rationality and responsiveness to reasons. Nevertheless, he thought it was wrong to torture an animal and to mistreat it. But why was it wrong? The animal wasn't being wronged, on Kant's view, but rather, by mistreating the animal, we were in some way corrupting our own character, or maybe practicing behaviors that are vicious and that would cause us to mistreat our fellow human beings, who Kant thought were the ultimate beings that are owed respect intrinsically and ought to be treated as means in and of themselves. So I could imagine an analysis about digital duplicates that's a little bit like this. Somebody might say, look, there's nothing it's like to be a digital duplicate. The digital duplicate doesn't experience pleasures or pains on most leading theories. And so if you behave in a nasty manner towards somebody's digital duplicate by insulting it, by failing to respond compassionately when it performs sadness, you might think that you're not wronging the digital duplicate because it's not the sort of entity that can be wronged. But you might nevertheless think that you are behaving wrongly, that you ought not to treat the digital duplicate that way because, in some sense, you're licensing yourself to engage with entities that are human-like in various respects in a way that we ought not to practice. You could take maybe a virtue ethics, sort of Aristotelian approach to this. You know, we're habituating ourselves poorly when we allow ourselves to mistreat a digital duplicate of another person. And then finally, I think there might be a sense in which you're indirectly wronging the human that's represented by the digital duplicate in something like the example of the video game. So if I know that this digital duplicate substantially encodes psychological features of a person that are distinctive of them, that's the whole point about these digital duplicates, is they're not just generic large language models. They're fine-tuned on sometimes very intimate details of a person's life and aspects of their psychology that maybe they've only shared with certain people before. If I know that this digital duplicate in some sense represents a human, by behaving in an untoward manner toward the digital duplicate, I can imagine some sort of analysis according to which I'm indirectly wronging the human who is represented by the digital duplicate. But that's as far as I've thought about it. I mean, as you can tell, these are very preliminary thoughts because we've never had real digital duplicates before. They've only ever existed in this form in the last year or so. Yes, over here in the black shirt.
Okay, thank you, Professor. It's actually related to the previous question. I was thinking about this example, like maybe we can make a digital duplicate of Nikola Tesla, and we can add to this digital duplicate the books that he has read, everything that he has made. Then, accidentally, then not accidentally, then we put like new knowledge into that digital duplicate. Then we ask this digital duplicate to make new invention of Nikola Tesla. But Nikola Tesla, for example, he against capitalism. Like he doesn't want his publication to be like profit for governments or economical lives. So if the invention or maybe like the owner of this digital duplicate choose to erase the moral or the philosophical view of Nikola Tesla, will it be a harm for like Nikola Tesla himself, or the digital duplicate? And I want to ask a little bit of life extension, because I think life extension is really related into biological kind of field like bioethics. Then maybe, and bioethics, I think it's really related to a big change of big data of health. So for example, we have this digital duplicate of ourselves and our biological things as well. Then in this biological field, we can see the forecasting of our health. Then this data maybe can be shared to the governments and can be shared to the corporate, and then they make it to analysis for the like insurance or turnover or the like pension, and this can make a new gap into the society. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Well, the pattern of very excellent questions continues with your very insightful set of observations. So I guess I'll start with the Nikola Tesla example and then come to the notion of biological digital twins, which also is a more long-standing literature, because you're right, in healthcare, there's long been an attempt to try in the area of personalized medicine to come up with computer models of specific bodily processes that I have based on data that I generate that can then be used for predictive purposes and so forth, and can also be misused, as you rightly point out. The Nikola Tesla example is very interesting because in a paper my colleagues and I published just last month, we raised the example of historical figures being trained into a model that would capture their knowledge and their writing style and so forth. And on the one hand, there's a question of what are the different ways we might use this reanimated historical figure. I mean, imagine Socrates, in some sense, coming back to life, purely metaphorically. You can imagine certain wonderful things that could come from this. I mean, you could imagine when you're teaching school children about great thinkers of the past, that rather than reading a boring, dry, old textbook, they could actually engage with Socrates, who could actually engage in a Socratic dialogue with them. I mean, imagine engaging with a Socratic dialogue with Socrates, rather than just learning about and reading about the dialogues Socrates had in the past. I can imagine that would be extremely inspiring and interesting to many students. I would find it very interesting to get to do that. And it's quite interesting to think what happens when you pose questions to Socrates that the historical Socrates has no written record of ever having entertained. To me, that is quite an interesting phenomenon. So you can imagine a version of this where the duplicate of Socrates sort of elucidates various points that were raised in the texts that we have available, you know, from later students who tell us about Socrates. But now you ask Socrates, what do you think about the ethics of digital duplicates, for example? Or what do you think about some topic that Socrates never encountered? It's very interesting to me, what is the status then of the response? You know, is there a sense in which it's a reflection of what Socrates might say about this case? I mean, we do engage in this type of reasoning in philosophy all the time. So for example, we give Kantian analyses of new technologies. And in a way, what we're doing is we're imagining what Kant would say about a certain type of new technology that Kant never thought about, never encountered. And this seems to be perfectly legitimate when we do this in the form of just philosophical, using our philosophical imaginations. So I think it comes back to the question of reality again. As long as we know how a large language model works, which is very important, and we've published an article suggesting that education about how AI works should be mandatory starting in elementary school in an age-appropriate way, so that from the very first ages now, we'll know how to be critical toward the use of AI. We don't think of it as some sort of godlike invention that we just automatically defer to because we're in awe of it. We need to be skeptical in the way that many of you have expressed skepticism. So as long as we know how it works and we understand that what's being generated, in some sense, reflects the type of reasoning that Socrates engaged in, but isn't some new proclamation from Socrates, then I think if we treat it like that, it's like what we do when we give a Kantian analysis of a new technology. And to my mind, that seems okay, and it seems generative and very interesting. The Tesla example that you raised is fascinating because in this case, you were talking about using a duplicate of Tesla to engage in activities that Tesla himself would have condemned. And there is a literature in philosophy about whether a person can be wronged after they die or harmed after they die, and it's debated. Some people say, when you're dead, you're dead. You have no further interests. So whatever happens, happens. But many societies have something like the view that the dead can be wronged, and that there are certain ways of showing respect to the dead. And it's unclear what the metaphysics are of this, whether they think the dead person still exists as a soul or something like that. That's maybe one view. Another thing is that people think someone really does exist in our memories. I mean, literally, we exist in each other's memories. Maybe I'll just elaborate this point because I think it's quite interesting. So all of you here are forming a memory of me based on my behavior, and you have no access to my internal life. I mean, you can't get inside my head. You don't know what my consciousness is, or even whether I'm conscious. I might be what's called a philosophical zombie, which is an entity that looks exactly like a human, is indistinguishable from a human, but there's nothing it's like inside. So there's a big debate about that. So the sense in which I exist for all of you is only in the sense of your interpretation of my behavior. I can never exist in any other form because you can't get outside of that. You can't get inside my head. So I have a perspective on myself, and I have a first-person perspective, and I have my own memories, and many of these memories you don't know, so you have a partial model of me. But the only sense in which I exist for all of you is as a little avatar that you're creating in your head of me. It's very incomplete. It's based on impressions and inferences. But if we know someone very well, if we have a close intimate who's spent their lives with us, with whom we've shared intimate details and so forth, their little avatar of us is pretty rich and robust. It may still not be the same as my own self-conception, but the point I want to make is that no one has my self-conception except for me. What they might have is my best attempt to share my self-conception through conversation. They might have their interpretations of my behavior. So in what I take to be a pretty fundamental metaphysical sense, we only ever exist in other people's memories. So when we die, we continue to exist, in my mind, in precisely the same form we only ever existed, which is in people's memories. The only difference that I see is that my seat of consciousness is no longer providing new behavior to update the model in your head. So my way of thinking about it is that if a person only ever exists outside of their own mind, in the minds and memories of others, and they continue to exist in precisely that way, and a person can be wronged, for example, by gossiping about them in a way that they never hear about. Suppose I tell a scurrilous lie about you to many people and harm your reputation, but you never find out about this. Now, if you have a purely hedonistic view of welfare and you might think that all that matters is your experience of pleasure and pain, you might say, well, at the end of the day, I don't know about it, so no harm, no foul. But I think many people would feel that I've really wronged you by lying about you and damaging your reputation, even if you don't ever find out about it. Many people would feel that way. So the Nikola Tesla case is really fascinating. I can imagine some people saying that if you've died long enough in the past, and if you are, in some sense, a public figure, then maybe you're sort of become, there's like a fair use clause or something like that, where your engagement with the public sphere means that you don't really get to have control over how people respect your legacy or not. Whereas for maybe a private citizen, we might think that, look, they didn't put themselves in the public light, and maybe we owe them a different kind of respect to their memory. But I can imagine you're a Nikola Tesla scholar or something, and you have a great reverence for Nikola Tesla, and you know about the details of Nikola Tesla, including the kinds of values that he had while he lived, and you just know for sure that Nikola Tesla would absolutely hate a digital duplicate of himself being used to create some commercial product. I'd have to work out the philosophical details, and maybe you'll have to work out the philosophical details, but I certainly share the intuition that there's something unseemly about doing that, even though Nikola Tesla isn't alive anymore and isn't going to be subjectively harmed in terms of his conscious states or something like that. I think there's a sense in which it would be disrespectful to Tesla's legacy, so to speak. And I would think it would probably be wrong to use a digital duplicate of Tesla in a way that we have good reason to think he would reject. That's my initial impression, but I'd have to work on it some more. Okay, time is up. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions.